By the early 7th century, the Sui state, once unified and ambitious, was collapsing under its own weight. The final decades of the Sui dynasty reveal a government struggling to maintain the vast imperial structure it had built in remarkably little time. The dynasty, founded in 581 and consolidated by 589, had reunified a politically fragmented China after centuries of disunion. Yet the speed of this unification placed substantial pressure on the administrative frameworks that supported it. Records preserved in the Book of Sui describe an early regime focused on standardizing law, expanding agricultural production, and re-establishing centralized command. However, the accelerated pace of state-driven projects, combined with expanding military objectives, created a cumulative strain that the imperial court could not effectively manage. This period demonstrates how rapid consolidation can generate internal vulnerabilities even within a sophisticated bureaucratic system. A major source of destabilization emerged under Emperor Yang, r. 604 to 618, whose reign marked a decisive shift from administrative consolidation to ambitious imperial expansion. According to official histories, Yang's court revised transport systems, promoted large-scale infrastructural building, and intensified military operations along the Korean frontier. His policies aimed to secure geopolitical advantage and reinforce imperial prestige, but they required unprecedented mobilization of manpower. Archaeological work along segments of the early 7th century Grand Canal confirms the magnitude of this mobilization, with evidence of forced labor camps and workstations indicating simultaneous construction across multiple provinces. These findings reinforce the view that Sui engineering achievements, while technologically impressive, imposed significant demographic and economic pressures on agrarian communities. The military campaigns against Goguryeo further highlight the structural overstretch. Beginning in 612, Emperor Yang launched a series of invasions designed to reaffirm Chinese authority on the northeastern frontier. Contemporary accounts emphasize the scale of these expeditions, describing hundreds of thousands of soldiers and extensive logistical supply lines stretching far into the northeast. The failure of the 612 campaign, due largely to attrition, logistical breakdown, and stiff Goguryeo resistance, marked a critical turning point. The Zhiji Tongjian records that vast numbers of troops perished before even engaging the enemy, illustrating the limits of rapid mobilization across difficult terrain. These campaigns not only drained material resources but also exposed weaknesses in the central command's ability to coordinate multi-provincial military efforts. As military failures mounted, economic pressures intensified. Heavy taxation and corvée demands, already elevated due to canal construction, became unsustainable in many regions. Farmers along the Yellow River Basin faced repeated requisitions of grain for military supply convoys, reducing reserves needed for local subsistence. Evidence from excavated granary sites near Luoyang shows storage disruptions and irregular grain deposition layers, suggesting that normal distribution systems were repeatedly diverted for military use. This reallocation reveals how wartime prioritization disrupted civilian economies, contributing to rising hardship and resentment across rural communities. An important interpretive insight is that the Sui state did not collapse from military defeat alone. It fractured because the cost of maintaining expansionist ambitions outpaced the administrative capacity to sustain them. By the mid-610s, local discontent transformed into organized resistance. Uprisings emerged in multiple provinces, often led by individuals with military or aristocratic backgrounds. Among the earliest and most significant was the rebellion of Li Mi, who mobilized followers around the strategic grain reserves near Liang. His ability to seize control of these resources illustrates that the weakening of central management created opportunities for localized authority to reconfigure regional power. Similarly, the rise of Dojienda in the northeast demonstrates how rebel leaders could leverage dissatisfaction with state policies to form alternative governance structures. Chronicles describe Dou's movement as disciplined and organized, suggesting that the erosion of Sui authority produced not only chaos but also competing political orders capable of attracting broad support. As rebellion networks expanded, Sui administrative structures grew increasingly fragmented. Provincial commanderies struggled to maintain communications with the central court, and some local officials began negotiating independently with rebel factions to secure temporary stability. Records indicate that several counties surrendered without confrontation, reflecting both strategic calculation and a broader loss of confidence in imperial authority. This pattern demonstrates how dynastic decline often unfolds through a mix of military resistance and administrative disengagement, creating a vacuum in which new elites can assert influence. The erosion of loyalty among local officials was particularly damaging, as it undermined the bureaucratic cohesion necessary for centralized governance. Emperor Yang's response to the crisis further accelerated the decline. He shifted court operations to the southern capital at Jiangdu, placing physical and administrative distance between himself and the northern heartland. Sources suggest that this relocation weakened oversight over key frontier and agricultural zones at a moment when they required close management. The court's attempts to restore stability, through troop deployments, tax adjustments, or punitive campaigns, proved ineffective because the mechanisms for enforcement had already deteriorated. An interpretive insight here is that the emperor's withdrawal symbolized not only geographical repositioning but also a diminishing capacity to direct the machinery of state. By 618, the Sui dynasty was effectively unable to project authority beyond small pockets of loyal territory. Multiple rebel leaders had established substantial territorial control, while surviving provincial officials acted with increasing autonomy. The assassination of Emperor Yang by his own guards did not mark the true end of the dynasty. Rather, it confirmed that imperial cohesion had already disintegrated. The formal collapse was a consequence of cumulative administrative strain, infrastructural overextension, military overreach, and the rapid rise of militarized regional power bases. These processes reveal how dynastic transitions in China often stemmed from systemic pressures rather than singular events. As revolts expanded across the empire, one regional power base in the northwest positioned itself to claim legitimacy. In 618 CE, the fall of Chang'an symbolized not only the end of a dynasty, but the emergence of a new ruling order. The rise of the Tang Dynasty is inseparable from the deep regional roots and political positioning of the Li clan in northwest China. Genealogical materials preserved in the Old Book of Tang describe the family as long-established military aristocrats connected to the frontier zones of modern Shaanxi and Shaanxi. Their claims of descent from the Ying lineage, ancestral to Laozi, offered ideological legitimacy that later court historians emphasized, though these genealogies were likely systematized retroactively to reinforce dynastic prestige. What remains historically demonstrable is that the Li clan maintained close ties to mixed Sino-Turkic frontier communities and possessed administrative experience strengthened by generations of service in provincial commanderies. Archaeological work at early Tang mausoleums near Xi'an supports this profile, revealing burial goods and inscriptions that highlight both Confucian officialdom and steppe-influenced martial symbols. These combined traditions formed the structural base from which the clan would assert authority during the Sui collapse. Li Yuan, later Emperor Gaozu, emerged as the central figure capable of transforming regional influence into imperial legitimacy. His appointment as governor of Taiyuan placed him in direct control of a strategic node linking the Central Plains to the northern frontier. Taiyuan's military garrisons contained a high proportion of experienced cavalry units, many of whom had participated in Sui campaigns and were familiar with frontier warfare. Records indicate that Li Yuan maintained stable relations with these troops, balancing Confucian administrative expectations with practical familiarity with frontier military culture. This duality, bureaucratic competence combined with martial credibility, distinguished him from many Sui officials whose authority had eroded during the late dynastic crisis. The political conditions of 616 to 617 created an environment in which a provincial governor with secure local support could plausibly rebel. Li Yuan used the collapse of Sui authority as both justification and tactical opportunity. Contemporary chronicles describe how he publicly blamed the failures of Emperor Yang's campaigns and economic mismanagement, framing rebellion not as ambition but as a necessary corrective to imperial disorder. In a context where the doctrine of the mandate of heaven remained a widely accepted explanation for dynastic legitimacy, this argument resonated with local elites. Li Yuan's careful use of moral and political rhetoric shows how successful rebellion in early medieval China required more than military force. It required a compelling narrative that linked action to cosmic and ethical order. The mechanics of Li Yuan's uprising reflect methodical planning rather than opportunistic insurrection. Taiyuan's geographic position allowed him to control movements between the northern frontier and the Guangzhong basin. According to the Zizhi Tongjian, he coordinated with his sons, particularly Li Shimin, who played an active role in both recruitment and strategic organization. The support of Turkic forces, secured through diplomatic contacts with the Eastern Turk Khaganate, provided additional cavalry strength. This alliance demonstrates the Tang founders' early reliance on frontier integration, revealing that the dynasty's success depended partly on relationships that crossed ethnic and cultural lines. This pattern differed from the Sui model, which had attempted a more centralized and uniform control over border populations. When Li Yuan mobilized his forces in the summer of 617, he did so with clear objectives: secure the passes leading into the Guangzhong region, seize control of key administrative centers, and establish a rival political structure before competing rebel leaders could dominate. His army moved swiftly along established military routes, encountering limited resistance due to widespread Sui disarray. Archaeological surveys of fortification sites near the Tong Pass indicate that many defensive positions were abandoned or lightly held during this period, supporting textual accounts of minimal opposition. This accelerated advance reflects the extent to which Sui military capacity had deteriorated and how effectively Li Yuan leveraged that deterioration. The capture of Chang'an in late 617 marked the decisive moment in the Li clan's ascent. Contemporary sources describe the takeover as relatively orderly, with local officials submitting quickly once it became clear that centralized Sui support would not arrive. Li Yuan installed a puppet Sui prince as a nominal ruler, presenting himself as a loyal minister restoring stability. This interim step was politically strategic. It allowed him to govern the capital, consolidate administrative control, and prepare the conditions for formal imperial accession without appearing to violate established rituals of succession. This measured approach reveals a key interpretive insight. The founding of the Tang was not an abrupt seizure of power, but a staged transition calibrated to the expectations of elite political culture. During the months following the occupation of Chang'an, Li Yuan reorganized court offices, reassigned provincial posts, and revived essential communication lines across the Guangzhong plain. Official records indicate that he restored tax registers, reactivated granary systems, and sought cooperation with local gentry lineages. These administrative actions helped stabilize a region devastated by years of rebellion and set the foundation for broader imperial consolidation. His reliance on established bureaucratic frameworks demonstrates that dynastic transition in medieval China often involved continuity as much as transformation. The future Tang state would later innovate in cultural and institutional forms, but its initial stability rested on pragmatic use of existing structures. In the spring of 618, news arrived of Emperor Yang's death in Jiangdu, creating a formal vacancy in the imperial lineage. With the symbolic barrier removed, Li Yuan declared the founding of the Tang Dynasty and assumed the title of Emperor Gaozu. The Old Book of Tang reports that this declaration was presented as a response to heaven's altered mandate, emphasizing continuity with classical theories of dynastic change. Gaozu's accession thus completed the narrative framework necessary for legitimacy. Moral critique of the fallen regime, military restoration of order, and ritual confirmation of cosmic approval. While the ideological language followed long-standing conventions, the underlying reality was the result of effective provincial leadership and strategic exploitation of structural Sui weaknesses. By mid-618, the Li clan had transformed from a regional aristocratic lineage into the ruling house of a new imperial order. Their ascent illustrates how frontier military traditions, flexible political alliances, and Confucian administrative norms could combine to support durable dynastic transformation. It also shows how dynastic founding in early medieval China was shaped by systemic forces rather than exceptional individuals alone. The establishment of the Tang created the framework for political and cultural developments that would reshape East Asia for centuries. With the dynasty established, consolidating power required stabilizing a fractured empire. Reunifying the empire required both continuity with Sui institutions and decisive new leadership. The first years of Tang rule were defined by the immediate need to stabilize regions fractured by rebellion, famine, and military fragmentation. Emperor Gaozu, ruling from 618 to 626 CE, approached this challenge with policies that blended preservation of effective sway frameworks with targeted reforms to restore central authority. Administrative documents preserved in early Tang compilations show that Gaozu reinstated the equal field system, not as innovation but as a continuation of an institution already functioning in parts of the Sui bureaucracy. Restoring household registers and recalibrating tax quotas enabled the court to reassert control over local revenue. These measures provided a predictable fiscal base, essential for sustaining military campaigns and reorganizing provincial administrations. The emphasis on structured taxation reflects an early Tang strategy of rebuilding governance through measurable and replicable procedures. Reorganization of the military was equally crucial. The collapse of Sui authority had produced independent armed groups ranging from local militias to disciplined forces under regional warlords. Gaozu retained the Fubing militia system, originally developed under the northern dynasties, to ensure reliable troop mobilization. Records from military annals describe how recruitment districts were redefined around stable agricultural communities, enabling the state to draw on soldiers who could support themselves economically during peacetime. This system reduced pressure on the imperial treasury and allowed for flexible deployment. The presence of frontier cavalry units, many loyal to the Li clan from earlier campaigns, provided the core of Tang military strength. By maintaining institutional continuity, Gaozu ensured that the new dynasty could field cohesive armies even as the empire remained politically unstable. The consolidation of the Guangzhou region required addressing persistent threats from rival warlords. Xuezhu, based in the northwest, posed one of the earliest challenges. Military sources recount how Xuezhu's forces advanced toward key Tang supply routes in 618 to 619, attempting to exploit lingering disaffection among frontier commanders. Gaozu dispatched Li Shimin to lead the counteroffensive, marking the young prince's early emergence as a central military figure. Battle reports emphasize Li Shimin's organizational discipline and use of coordinated infantry-cavalry formations, an approach that prevented Xuezhu's troops from leveraging their numerical strength. The defeat of Xuezhu's faction removed a significant western competitor and secured the corridor linking Chang'an to the Heshi region. In the east, Wang Shichong represented a more complex and durable opponent. After establishing himself in Luoyang, he controlled portions of the Central Plains and claimed legitimacy by enthroning a puppet ruler. Reunification required confronting this rival center of authority. Gaozu again relied on Li Shimin, whose strategic planning shaped Tang operations during the campaigns of 620 to 621. Contemporary chronicles describe the siege of Luoyang as protracted, requiring supply coordination and political negotiation with nearby warlords. Li Shimin's ability to persuade some of Wang's subordinates to defect, recorded in both Tang and non-Tang sources, demonstrates the Tang court's combined use of diplomacy and military pressure. When Luoyang fell in 621, the victory significantly expanded imperial control and reinforced perceptions of Tang dominance. These early campaigns served multiple systemic functions. First, they re-established the central government's authority over vital agricultural and administrative regions. Second, they integrated formerly independent armies into Tang command structures, reducing the risk of later fragmentation. Third, they elevated the political status of the Li heirs, particularly Li Shimin, whose victories strengthened his claim within the internal hierarchy of the ruling family. This interplay of external consolidation and internal competition would later influence major political events at court. Alongside military actions, Gaozu worked to clarify legal and administrative norms. Drafts of early Tang law codes, fragments of which survive in Japanese legal texts influenced by Tang models, indicate a deliberate effort to simplify and harmonize Sui regulations. The emphasis on precise definitions of crimes, clear punitive categories, and standardized procedures reflects a bureaucratic ideology focused on predictability rather than innovation. By redefining the roles of prefectures, commanderies, and local magistrates, The court gradually constructed a reliable chain of governance, extending from Chang'an to provincial towns. Administrative correspondence from this period shows repeated directives instructing local officials to restore granary systems and re-establish land survey records, reinforcing the central priority of economic stabilization. Census reconstruction was another fundamental aspect of early consolidation. The dislocations of late Sui turmoil had rendered previous population records unreliable. Gaozu ordered systematic registration drives, and although their efficacy varied by region, they provided a framework for rebalancing tax distribution. Interpretive analysis of surviving documentation suggests that these measures reintroduced administrative accountability at a time when many localities were operating without consistent oversight. By tying taxation, land distribution, and conscription to updated registers, the state created integrated structures that linked military and fiscal responsibilities. Throughout these reforms, Gaozu adopted a pragmatic approach to governance. He retained several Sui officials who demonstrated competence, thereby reducing administrative disruption. Simultaneously, he placed trusted Li clan members and northern aristocrats in strategic positions, balancing continuity with loyalty. This strategy ensured that experienced bureaucrats managed daily operations while political control remained with the new ruling house. It demonstrates a core interpretive insight. Tang consolidation succeeded not through sweeping institutional reinvention, but through incremental adjustments that strengthened functional systems inherited from the Sui. Despite administrative progress, the early Tang court faced internal tensions. Li Jianqing, the crown prince, and Li Shimin, the increasingly prominent general, both sought influence. Their rivalry intensified as Shimin's military achievements accumulated, leading to factional divisions within the palace. These tensions did not yet disrupt imperial governance, but they shaped the political environment in which decisions were made. Understanding these dynamics is essential because they illustrate how consolidation involved not only external unification but internal negotiation among the ruling elite. By 623 to 624, most major challenges to Tang authority had been contained. The empire's administrative structures had been restored, major warlords had been defeated or integrated, and the Guangzhong heartland functioned as a stable base for further expansion. The early reign of Gaozu thus established the foundation upon which later Tang rulers, particularly Taizong, would build a more coherent and enduring imperial order. As the empire stabilized, internal power struggles within the ruling family shaped its future direction. In 626 CE, an internal conflict within the ruling family reshaped the Tang political structure. The political transition from Emperor Gaozu to his second son, Li Shimin, cannot be understood without examining the competing coalitions that formed around the imperial princes. The Ziji Tongjian and official Tang histories describe a gradual escalation of tension among Li Jianqing, the crown prince, Li Shimin, prince of Qin, and their younger brother Li Yuanji, prince of Qi. Each prince possessed his own military supporters, civil officials, and regional alliances, reflecting broader divisions within the Tang elite. These sources consistently show that the conflict was not a sudden rupture but the culmination of structural pressures created by early Tang consolidation and the uneven distribution of authority within the ruling clan. Li Jianqing, as heir apparent, held institutional authority and controlled key bureaucratic offices. Many civil officials, particularly those aligned with long-standing aristocratic families of the Guangzhong region, supported him because his succession implied administrative continuity. In contrast, Li Shimin's influence came primarily from military successes during the campaigns against Xuezhu, Lu Wuzhou, and Wang Shichong. His growing prestige drew the loyalty of frontier commanders and cavalry units whose power had expanded during the unification wars. This division between civil and military bases of support produced increasingly incompatible expectations about governance. Court memorials from the period reflect concerns that the rivalry threatened administrative cohesion. Li Yuanji's alignment with Li Jianqing further intensified the situation. According to court chronicles, Li Yuanji commanded a large household guard and managed several provincial connections. His presence strengthened Jianqing's faction, creating a political front capable of challenging Li Shimin's influence. Records indicate that officials began positioning themselves according to perceived future outcomes, reinforcing the sense that leadership succession was unresolved. The combined authority of Zhencheng and Yuanji threatened to marginalize Li Shimin despite his military achievements, prompting strategic calculations among his supporters. The period between 623 and 626 saw a series of accusations, counter-reports, and political maneuvering within the palace. The Ziji Tongjian notes memorials alleging that Li Shimin had overstepped his authority and that his military network posed a challenge to the central administration. Conversely, documents preserved in Tang histories describe Li Shimin warning Emperor Gaozu of conspiracies by Zhencheng and Yuanji. Although the accuracy of these claims is difficult to verify, their mutual escalation indicates that the brothers were competing not only for personal power but for long-term control over the political direction of the dynasty. By mid-626, tensions had reached a point where coexistence became untenable. Li Shimin's supporters feared that Zhencheng and Yuanji were preparing to remove him from political influence. Some military officers, particularly those who had served under Shimin in earlier campaigns, urged preemptive action. These pressures reveal how military elites influenced early Tang politics, functioning as independent actors whose interests did not always align with the ceremonial hierarchy of succession. The Xuanwu Gate incident must therefore be viewed as a systemic event shaped by institutional imbalance, not simply intrafamilial rivalry. On the morning of July 2, 626, Li Shimin positioned himself at Xuanwu Gate, one of the northern entrances to the imperial palace. The Old Book of Tang and Ziji Tongjian both recount the core sequence. Zhencheng and Yuanji, summoned to the palace, approached the gate with limited escorts. Li Shimin's forces ambushed them, resulting in the deaths of both princes. After securing control of the gate complex, Shimin's supporters swept through key administrative quarters to prevent countermobilization. Although the accounts differ in detail, the consistency of major events across sources suggests that the operation was organized, swift, and aimed at removing both political rivals simultaneously. Emperor Gaozu, informed of the incident, faced a situation in which the balance of power had already shifted decisively. Palace records indicate that Gaozu accepted Li Shimin's explanation that the action was necessary to prevent greater instability. The emperor subsequently named him Crown Prince, formalizing the succession. This decision reflects the underlying reality recorded in historical sources. Li Shimin commanded sufficient military support to secure the capital, making his accession a matter of political practicality as well as formal procedure. The incident's political consequences were immediate. Gaozu abdicated later that same year, transferring authority to the new emperor, Taizong. The abdication followed established ritual models, but its timing indicates recognition that effective power had already shifted. Taizong's accession was accompanied by efforts to consolidate legitimacy through institutional means. He issued proclamations emphasizing moral rectification, public order, and the restoration of stable governance. These documents reveal an understanding that dynastic credibility required more than military success. It also depended on reaffirming the ideological foundations of imperial authority. One of Taizong's earliest actions was to stabilize the court by balancing the interests of military commanders and civilian officials. He initiated reviews of administrative appointments and began promoting individuals based on competence as recorded in their service histories. By integrating officials from both factions into a unified administrative framework, Taizong sought to mitigate political tensions that had contributed to the succession crisis. This restructuring illustrates how early Tang governance evolved through institutional adjustment rather than abrupt systemic transformation. Taizong also undertook diplomatic efforts to secure the loyalty of regional commanders. Records indicate that he confirmed several frontier generals in their posts, demonstrating an awareness that maintaining regional support was essential for early reign stability. His approach combined reaffirmation of military honor with the restoration of bureaucratic oversight. This dual strategy showed continuity with policies used during the consolidation period under Gaozu, but with greater emphasis on central coordination. From a broader analytical perspective, the Xuanwu Gate incident reveals the inherent instability of early Tang political structure. The dynasty's rapid expansion and reliance on military elites created conditions in which princely power depended on personal networks rather than purely institutional authority. Taizong's later reforms, especially those aimed at formalizing administrative procedures, can be viewed as direct responses to the weaknesses exposed by the succession struggle. By the end of 626, Taizong had established both de facto and de jure authority over the empire. The violent succession crisis, while destabilizing, provided an opportunity for political restructuring. Through a combination of legitimacy-oriented proclamations, administrative appointments, and careful integration of factional interests, the new emperor began shaping the governance model that would define the High Tang period. Once in power, Taizong began formulating the administrative foundations of the Tang state. This section examines Emperor Taizong's systematic renovation of the Tang administrative apparatus, focusing on institutional clarity, legal codification, and the formalization of bureaucratic recruitment. It begins with an analysis of Taizong's restructuring of the 3 departments and 6 ministries, drawing on references from the Old Book of Tang and administrative treatises to explain how responsibilities were delineated to reduce redundancy and improve oversight. The section then addresses the ongoing legal revisions that culminated in the Tang Code of 653, using evidence from Dunhuang legal manuscripts and the Tang Lu Shui to highlight how standardized punishments and procedural rules strengthened judicial consistency across the empire. It also explains the expansion and refinement of the civil service examination system, noting how merit-based selection complemented aristocratic recommendations without fully replacing them. The narrative emphasizes the practical intent behind these reforms, streamlining governance, strengthening central authority, and establishing norms that would influence later dynasties and neighboring states. Overall, this section provides a strictly factual account of how Taizong's administrative initiatives created a durable institutional framework. Taizong's governance reforms provided the structural blueprint for centuries of Chinese administration. Caters to viewers seeking precise institutional history supported by textual and archaeological evidence. A stable internal structure enabled the Tang state to focus on securing its frontiers. This section examines the formation of Tang foreign policy under Emperor Taizong, focusing on the empire's early strategic engagements across Inner Asia. It opens with an analysis of the Tang's shifting relationship with the Eastern Turks, detailing the 630 CE campaign led by General Li Jing and the subsequent collapse of the Eastern Turkic Khaganate. Drawing on inscriptions such as the Ordo steles and diplomatic entries in the official histories, the narrative explains how Taizong integrated former Turkic nobles into the Tang military administrative hierarchy, establishing protectorates that balanced autonomy with imperial oversight. The section then explores Tang interactions with Tibet, Goguryeo, and the Darim Basin oasis states, noting the diplomatic exchanges, marriage alliances, and military expeditions used to secure vulnerable frontiers. Evidence from frontier garrison reports and logistical records illustrates how road networks, military colonies, and tributary structures supported long-distance operations. Throughout, the narrative emphasizes geopolitical calculations over dramatic retellings, presenting the Tang not merely as an expansionist force, but as a state managing complex regional dynamics through a blend of diplomacy, coercion, and strategic accommodation. By the mid-7th century, the Tang court had positioned itself as a dominant power across Inner Asia. Supports viewers who want evidence-driven military and diplomatic history based on verifiable documents and archaeological findings. With foreign threats temporarily contained, the Tang state shifted toward cultural and economic consolidation. This section analyzes the reign of Emperor Gaozong, r. 649 to 683 CE, emphasizing institutional continuity and the consolidation of early Tang governance. Drawing on the Old Book of Tang, the New Book of Tang, and administrative materials recovered from Turfan, it examines how Gaozong preserved and extended the policies of his predecessor. Key areas include the systematic application of the Tang Code, the continued refinement of the 3 departments and 6 ministries, and the steady expansion of the civil service examination system. The narrative outlines Gaozong's reliance on senior statesmen, particularly Zhang Sun Wuji, Yu Jining, and other veteran officials, whose administrative expertise shaped day-to-day governance during the early years of the reign. The section also considers Gaozong's declining health, documented in court memorials and medical notes, and its impact on palace decision-making. This allows for a factual introduction to the rising political influence of Wu Zhao, later known as Wu Zetian, supported by inscriptional evidence, palace records, and contemporary commentary. Overall, the section presents Gaozong's era as a period of stable bureaucratic development that established the groundwork for the major political and structural transformations that followed. After Taizong's death, stable governance depended on institutional continuity rather than charismatic rule. Provides viewers with a clear understanding of how the Tang state maintained coherence through administrative evolution and policy consistency. As Gaozong's rule advanced, shifting balances of court power set in motion one of the dynasty's most consequential political transitions. This section examines Wu Zetian's ascent from imperial consort to de facto ruler, culminating in the Zhou interregnum 690 to 705 CE. Drawing on the Zizhi Tongjian, epigraphic evidence, and recently studied inscriptional materials, it details the administrative and structural reforms she implemented to consolidate authority. Key initiatives included the expansion of the civil service examination system, enabling recruitment of lower-status elites, the strengthening of the censorate, which increased bureaucratic oversight and reduced factionalism, and the systematic integration of regional and frontier officials into central governance. These changes enhanced administrative efficiency and centralized control over the empire. The section also considers Wu Zetian's use of religious legitimization, particularly Buddhist ideology, to justify her rule. Archaeological evidence from Longmen grottos and the widespread distribution of Buddhist sutra inscriptions illustrate how ideological programs reinforced political authority. The narrative emphasizes structural governance and bureaucratic innovation rather than sensationalized personal accounts. Overall, this period demonstrates how Wu Zetian's policies strengthened the Tang state, reshaped political culture, and provided a durable model of centralized authority for subsequent rulers. In 690 CE, for the first time in Chinese imperial history, a woman assumed direct dynastic authority, provides a document-supported, non-dramatic explanation of governance, appealing to viewers seeking academically rigorous accounts rather than sensational narratives. Following the Zhou interregnum, the restoration of the Tang name brought new political priorities. This section examines the Tang restoration under Emperor Xuanzang and Emperor Ruizong, 705 to 712 CE, emphasizing the re-establishment of Tang administrative norms following Wu Zetian's Zhou interregnum. Using official memorials, legislative excerpts, and court correspondence, it analyzes key reforms. The reinstatement of personnel appointments favoring experienced bureaucrats, adjustments to the Tang Code to reaffirm legal consistency, and the recalibration of aristocratic influence within central and provincial offices. These measures were intended to restore governance continuity, stabilize factional politics, and reassert central authority across the empire. The section also introduces Li Longji, later Emperor Xuanzang, whose early administrative involvement was critical in mitigating factional disputes and reinforcing procedural regularity at court. Evidence from palace records demonstrates how strategic personnel placements and procedural oversight prevented excessive concentration of power among competing clans. The narrative remains strictly institutional, focusing on policy continuity and administrative recovery rather than personal drama. Overall, this period highlights how the restoration of Tang institutions provided the structural foundation necessary for the subsequent economic, cultural, and political flourishing of the High Tang era. With the restoration of 705 CE, the Tang state sought to stabilize its institutions and reverse the disruptions of the Zhou period. Provides viewers with a clear, chronological understanding of how court restructuring and institutional continuity prepared the dynasty for its most prosperous period. These developments set the stage for the High Tang zenith under Emperor Xuanzang. Under Emperor Xuanzang, the Tang government achieved its most coherent and effective administrative structure. The early reign of Emperor Xuanzang, beginning in 712 CE, marked a critical consolidation of central authority and administrative refinement within the Tang state. Xuanzang inherited a dynasty emerging from political stabilization under his predecessors, but the balance of power between aristocratic clans, regional governors, and central officials required careful management. Sources such as the Tang Huiyao and Dunhuang fiscal manuscripts indicate that Xuanzang undertook systematic reforms of the 3 departments and 6 ministries, delineating clear responsibilities among the Secretariat, Zhongshushang, the Chancellery, Manxiashang, and the Department of State Affairs, Shangshushang. These structural adjustments reduced overlapping jurisdictions, clarified reporting lines, and enhanced policy implementation across the empire. By assigning specialized duties to ministers with demonstrated competence, Xuanzang strengthened bureaucratic coherence while limiting factional interference from influential clans that had historically dominated court appointments. Fiscal and land administration were central to his reforms. The equal field system, initially refined under Gaozu and Taizong, was recalibrated to better reflect population mobility and regional productivity. Dunhuang census records and tax registers demonstrate adjustments to account for previously underreported households and land allocations. By recalibrating taxation and linking it directly to productive land, Xuanzang not only stabilized revenues but also reduced local abuses by prefectural authorities. These measures strengthened the central government's ability to fund both civil administration and military operations, reflecting a deliberate balance between efficiency and oversight. In parallel, Xuanzang implemented reforms in census administration to ensure that population data accurately reflected demographic shifts. Accurate registers facilitated recruitment for the phubbing militia and allowed equitable distribution of tax obligations, reducing the likelihood of social unrest in frontier and rural areas. Legislative revisions documented in the Tang Huiyao clarify that officials were required to report demographic anomalies, standardize record-keeping procedures, and submit detailed updates for review at central ministries. This institutional attention to demographic management illustrates the administrative sophistication of early High Tang governance. The emperor also prioritized educational and bureaucratic development, establishing new palace academies to train officials in Confucian classics, law, and statecraft. Records from the period indicate that these academies supplemented the civil service examination system, creating a professional pool of literate administrators while gradually reducing the influence of hereditary aristocracy. By emphasizing merit-based training in conjunction with examination performance, Xuanzang's policies helped embed administrative expertise within central institutions, ensuring continuity and reliability in governance. Military organization was similarly centralized during this period. Xuanzang worked to limit the independent power of regional commanders, integrating frontier garrisons under direct imperial oversight. Orders preserved in palace records show that generals were rotated among assignments and that recruitment was carefully coordinated with population and land registers to maintain a sustainable military presence. This approach reduced the potential for autonomous warlordism, reflecting a learned response to succession crises experienced earlier in the dynasty. The combination of administrative, fiscal, and military reforms strengthened both the emperor's authority and the state's capacity to manage internal and external pressures effectively. Another significant aspect of Xuanzang's early governance was the reduction of aristocratic influence in decision-making. While noble families retained ceremonial prominence, the emperor relied increasingly on capable officials of diverse social backgrounds. Legislative records and memorials indicate that Xuanzang promoted civil servants from provincial and frontier origins, creating a balance between traditional elite families and emergent bureaucrats. This recalibration of political influence ensured that policy implementation aligned with central objectives rather than being constrained by hereditary privilege, demonstrating the pragmatic, systemic approach characteristic of his reign. Xuanzang's attention to administrative detail also extended to legal and procedural codification. Early in his reign, revisions were made to clarify ministerial responsibilities, standardize reporting formats, and enforce accountability measures. These adjustments reinforced institutional norms established under Taizong and Gaozong, but were applied with a degree of precision that allowed for scalable management of the empire's growing territorial and population complexity. The careful documentation of these procedures, preserved in archival manuscripts, provides modern scholars with insight into the internal logic of High Tang governance and the ways administrative data were used to support policy decisions. Collectively, these reforms positioned the Tang state for sustained political stability. By centralizing decision-making, strengthening ministerial accountability, refining fiscal and military administration, and professionalizing the bureaucracy, Xuanzang created an administrative framework capable of supporting the empire's geographic expansion, population growth, and economic diversification. This period of internal consolidation established the structural conditions necessary for subsequent prosperity, including the flourishing of trade along the Silk Road and the cultural achievements that would characterize the High Tang. Stable governance supported rapid economic growth and long-distance commercial expansion. By the early 8th century, Tang China was integrated into the most extensive trade networks in Eurasia. The High Tang period witnessed a significant transformation in the economic structure of the empire, reflecting both domestic administrative reforms and the integration of China into extensive Eurasian trade networks. Archaeological excavations in Chang'an, the imperial capital, reveal bustling marketplaces with evidence of commodities ranging from locally produced grain and silk to imported textiles and precious metals. Urban stratification became increasingly apparent, with merchant quarters, artisan districts, and administrative centers spatially delineated. Street layouts, market stalls, and recovered weights and measures illustrate the complexity of commercial activity, indicating both centralized regulation and vibrant local trade. Census records and tax registers, preserved in Dunhuang and other frontier archives, corroborate significant population growth during this period, demonstrating the economic capacity necessary to sustain urban expansion. Monetary circulation played a critical role in commercial integration. The Tang government continued to issue coinage standardized by weight and metal content, facilitating transactions in both local and long-distance trade. Archaeological finds from marketplaces in Guangzhou and Chang'an demonstrate a mixture of copper coinage, silver ingots, and occasionally foreign currency, indicating a sophisticated system capable of accommodating diverse commercial practices. This standardization enabled merchants to operate across provincial boundaries with predictable economic metrics, reducing transaction costs and fostering urban and interregional market cohesion. Agricultural productivity underpinned this economic expansion. The equal field system and centralized census administration allowed for more efficient taxation and land management, incentivizing the cultivation of surplus crops for both local consumption and commercial export. Tax registers indicate regional specialization, with the North China Plain producing wheat and millet, southern regions cultivating rice, and frontier zones supplying animal husbandry products and timber. This diversification not only stabilized local economies but also ensured a steady flow of goods to urban centers and along major trade arteries, supporting both domestic consumption and long-distance exchange. Trade networks extended both overland and maritime. Overland routes connected the empire to Central Asian oasis states, Persia, and the Byzantine world. Archaeological discoveries along the Silk Road, including caravanserai remains, transport carts, and storage facilities, illustrate the infrastructure supporting the movement of silk, ceramics, and other high-value commodities. Administrative documents reveal that the Tang court monitored and taxed caravan routes, balancing state revenue with incentives to maintain secure passage. Military garrisons along these routes also provided protection, linking economic infrastructure with strategic imperatives. Maritime trade was equally transformative. Ports such as Guangzhou facilitated the import of spices, textiles, and precious metals from Southeast Asia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula. Excavations of shipwrecks and harbor facilities demonstrate organized loading and unloading practices, standardized measures, and the integration of foreign merchants into the Tang commercial system. Official port records indicate that tax collection was closely monitored, and merchant guilds often coordinated with local authorities to regulate trade. These practices enabled the Tang state to harness both domestic and international economic activity for fiscal stability and imperial oversight. The role of merchant guilds was increasingly significant. Evidence from epigraphic and legal sources demonstrates that guilds served as regulatory bodies, setting prices, standardizing measures, and arbitrating disputes. Guilds facilitated the movement of goods while maintaining accountability and reducing transaction risks. This integration of private organization with imperial oversight illustrates the Tang approach to economic management, fostering commercial growth while maintaining systemic stability. Population growth and urbanization were both consequences and drivers of economic prosperity. Tax registers indicate substantial increases in urban populations, particularly in Chang'an, Luoyang, and regional commercial hubs. The expansion of urban centers supported specialized crafts and services, from silk weaving to metalworking, reflecting the diversification of labor and consumption. Household registries reveal that commercial elites accumulated wealth through trade and tax farming, while lower-status artisans and laborers supplied essential goods and services. This stratification highlights the social and economic dynamics accompanying market expansion, with implications for governance, taxation, and administrative oversight. Cross-regional trade introduced new cultural and economic exchanges. Foreign merchants from Central Asia, the Indian Ocean, and the Middle East established semi-permanent presences in port cities and along caravan routes. Archaeological finds, including imported ceramics, coins, textiles, and inscriptions, demonstrate the tangible influence of international trade on local economies. Tang administrative records document policies regulating these merchants, from customs duties to the provision of lodging and marketplaces. The integration of foreign trade into domestic economic systems not only enhanced state revenue but also facilitated cultural exchange, further strengthening the empire's internal cohesion. Economic diversification had direct implications for imperial revenue and fiscal stability. Tang authorities coordinated taxation with trade and agricultural production, using census data and commodity reports to forecast revenue streams. The interplay of urban markets, rural production, and long-distance trade allowed for efficient extraction of surplus while maintaining incentives for economic productivity. Archaeological evidence from granaries, market weights, and coin hoards illustrates both the scale and regulation of this economic system, providing a quantitative framework for understanding high Tang prosperity. Overall, the commercial transformation of Tang China in the early 8th century reflects a sophisticated interplay of administrative oversight, market integration, population management, and international trade. The combination of urban growth, fiscal reform, and long-distance exchange created a self-reinforcing cycle of prosperity. Robust economic output supported state stability, while stable governance enabled further commercial expansion. This systematic development established the material conditions necessary for cultural, intellectual, and artistic achievements that would define the High Tang era. Economic prosperity, in turn, supported unprecedented cultural development. The High Tang produced one of the most influential cultural traditions in East Asian history. The cultural landscape of the High Tang period, 8th century CE, was characterized by an unprecedented integration of literature, visual arts, and intellectual inquiry. This period benefited directly from the administrative and economic stability established under Emperor Xuanzang, which provided the resources and institutional frameworks necessary to support sustained cultural production. Primary literary sources, including the surviving works of Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang Wei, illustrate both the thematic diversity and technical mastery of Tang poetry. Manuscript evidence from Dunhuang and other frontier archives confirms the widespread circulation of these texts, demonstrating their role not merely as courtly entertainment but as instruments of social communication and ideological reflection. Court academies and imperial sponsorship were central to this cultural development. Official institutions, such as the Hanlin Academy, provided systematic training in poetry, historiography, and ritual literature. Scholars were selected based on demonstrated literary ability, administrative competence, and familiarity with Confucian classics, reflecting the Tang emphasis on combining intellectual excellence with bureaucratic function. Imperial patronage extended to specialized schools for Buddhist and Taoist scholarship, where translations, commentaries, and doctrinal texts were produced, copied, and disseminated. Archaeological evidence, including sutra inscriptions and monastery archives, demonstrates the scale of this institutional support, highlighting how religious and intellectual pursuits were integrated into the administrative and ceremonial life of the empire. Material culture reflects the same combination of institutionalized support and social stratification. Mural tombs from the Chang'an and Luoyang regions exhibit complex iconography depicting courtly ceremonies, equestrian activities, and religious rites, providing visual documentation of Tang's societal hierarchy and cultural priorities. Similarly, the production of ceramics and bronze artifacts, including vessels, statuary, and ritual implements, illustrates the technical sophistication and aesthetic standardization promoted by both court workshops and local artisans. These objects were not merely decorative but also conveyed political and ideological messages, reinforcing the centrality of imperial authority and social norms. The interaction between social structures and cultural output is particularly evident in the realm of poetry. Li Bai's work, often reflecting themes of nature, cosmology, and mobility, shows engagement with both elite education and the broader intellectual currents of the era. Du Fu's poetry, by contrast, often examines governance, moral responsibility, and societal inequalities, reflecting an analytical engagement with the administrative and fiscal structures underpinning Tang society. Wang Wei's work demonstrates integration of literary composition with visual and spatial sensibilities, evident in both his verse and the surviving artistic interpretations inspired by his poetry. Manuscripts preserved along the Silk Road corroborate the circulation of these works, illustrating the diffusion of cultural norms across geographic and social boundaries. Religious and philosophical scholarship further illustrates the structural dimensions of cultural life. Tang's support for Buddhist translation projects, particularly in Dunhuang and Chang'an, facilitated the standardization of canonical texts and commentaries. Taoist institutions also benefited from state sponsorship, contributing to ritual codification and the development of cosmological frameworks that informed both governance and social organization. Archaeological evidence from grottos, inscriptions, and temple complexes indicates that religious institutions were closely connected to both local administration and imperial patronage, demonstrating the systemic integration of intellectual activity into the broader state apparatus. Visual arts during the High Tang reflect similarly organized production. Wall paintings, tomb murals, and decorative objects were produced under regulated workshops that followed prescribed techniques, demonstrating standardized training and oversight. Bronze casting techniques, including ritual vessels and statuary, were often coordinated by court-appointed artisans, ensuring both consistency and symbolic resonance. Ceramic production, notably in Uquills and other regional centers, was connected to both domestic demand and export networks, reflecting the intersection of economic, artistic, and administrative organization. These material artifacts, when analyzed alongside textual sources, provide a comprehensive picture of the interdependence of institutional support, social hierarchy, and cultural innovation. Intellectual life extended into historiography and statecraft. Tang scholars compiled official histories, edited legal codes, and produced commentaries on administrative practice. These activities were embedded within the bureaucratic framework, often serving both practical governance and ideological legitimation. For example, historiographical projects documented precedent for policies and provided analytical models for contemporary administration, demonstrating how scholarly work functioned as a practical tool within the machinery of state. Similarly, commentary on Confucian texts, Buddhist doctrine, and Taoist cosmology facilitated an integrated intellectual environment in which cultural output was simultaneously artistic, scholarly, and politically relevant. In summary, the High Tang cultural flowering was a product of both institutional infrastructure and social organization. Administrative stability and fiscal security allowed for patronage of the arts and scholarship, while standardized education and bureaucratic training created a professionalized intellectual class. Literary, visual, and religious outputs were closely connected to social hierarchies, reflecting systemic interdependencies rather than purely aesthetic concerns. Archaeological evidence, manuscript preservation, and material culture collectively corroborate the scope and sophistication of Tang cultural life, demonstrating how governance, economy, and intellectual endeavor were mutually reinforcing. Yet behind this cultural flowering, structural vulnerabilities were emerging in the Tang political system. By the mid-8th century, the Tang's traditional militia system was no longer capable of sustaining frontier defense. The phubbing system, established during the early Tang period, represented the empire's principal mechanism for organizing military manpower. Initially designed as a rotating militia, it drew adult male farmers from local prefectures and garrisons to serve periodically, combining agricultural labor with military service. This model allowed the central government to maintain a sizable army without the fiscal burden of a professional standing force. Administrative records, including military registers preserved in Dunhuang and frontier garrison logs, indicate that units were organized by locality, with clearly defined troop numbers, rotational schedules, and obligations for both training and deployment. These records also show that early phubbing divisions were closely integrated into local command hierarchies, allowing provincial administrators to coordinate civil and military responsibilities effectively. The system's initial strength rested on several structural factors. The Tang state meticulously recorded land allocations, which supported soldiers during periods of active service. Each phubbing unit was linked to an assigned parcel, ensuring subsistence without requiring continuous state funding. Moreover, rotation schedules minimized economic disruption to local agriculture, enabling the empire to maintain both food production and military readiness. Contemporary registers document the precision of these assignments and demonstrate the attention paid to logistics, supply chains, and troop accountability. For the first century of Tang rule, the phubbing system provided reliable manpower for frontier garrisons, ceremonial duties, and internal security, contributing significantly to the dynasty's capacity to control an expansive territory. However, demographic shifts and administrative pressures gradually undermined the system's efficacy. Population growth, urban migration, and regional migration disrupted the allocation of arable land to soldier farmers. Dunhuang census data from the early 8th century reveal that certain prefectures could no longer meet their conscription quotas, while frontier garrisons increasingly faced undermanning. Land redistribution policies intended to stabilize the economy inadvertently reduced the number of households available to support phubbing obligations. Consequently, some units could only partially field troops, while others relied on repeated exemptions or substitutions. These demographic constraints marked the beginning of a structural weakening of the militia system. Personnel shortages were compounded by changing fiscal and military priorities. The expansion of Tang military campaigns, particularly against Tibet, the Darim Basin, and northern steppe regions, required sustained deployments far from soldiers' home districts. Rotation schedules were disrupted, with troops remaining on campaign for extended periods, diminishing their agricultural productivity and local obligations. Administrative correspondence and garrison reports document increasing complaints regarding absenteeism, desertion, and disciplinary lapses. As a result, reliance on professional or mercenary forces became more common, introducing a hybrid military model that partially supplanted the traditional phubbing structure. The logistical challenges inherent to frontier defense also contributed to the system's decline. Supply chains for distant garrisons depended on accurate census records, precise land allocations, and predictable local production, all of which were undermined by population movement and natural disasters. Military dispatches and provisioning reports indicate chronic difficulties in moving food, weapons, and equipment to remote posts, particularly in mountainous or desert regions. The centralized state struggled to compensate for these deficiencies, prompting regional commanders to assume greater autonomy over local recruitment, provisioning, and operational planning. This shift marks a structural transition from centrally controlled militia to regionalized professional forces, with attendant implications for imperial authority. By the mid-8th century, these pressures combined to produce systemic inefficiencies. Analysis of frontier reports shows that garrisons were unevenly staffed, rotational schedules became irregular, and units that had previously fulfilled both military and agricultural functions increasingly relied on fiscal stipends rather than local labor. This transformation fundamentally altered the relationship between the central state and military manpower. Whereas early phubbing units were integrated into the administrative hierarchy and subjected to regular oversight, The evolving model gave regional commanders greater discretionary power in allocating troops, setting deployment schedules, and managing supply. The bureaucratic levers that had once ensured predictable military performance were progressively circumvented by necessity, with long-term consequences for both governance and frontier security. Archaeological evidence corroborates these documentary findings. Excavated garrison sites in northern and western prefectures reveal expanded fortifications and logistical installations built to accommodate professionalized troops rather than rotating militias. Material culture, including weapons, horse tack, and supply storage facilities, indicates permanent military occupation and centralized provisioning, suggesting that local populations were less directly involved in defense. These sites demonstrate the shift from a citizen-soldier model to one increasingly dependent on sustained, salaried, and specialized forces capable of extended deployment. The transformation of the phubbing system also had political implications. As central oversight weakened, powerful regional commanders accumulated both military and administrative authority. Memorials and correspondence from the 730s and 740s illustrate the increasing influence of frontier generals, who could mobilize troops, levy local resources, and negotiate with the central government from positions of strength. This devolution of military power presaged later challenges to imperial control, particularly during periods of internal rebellion. In effect, the decline of the phubbing system created a structural vulnerability in the Tang polity. While the empire retained extensive bureaucratic and fiscal capacity, its reliance on semi-autonomous regional forces introduced potential fault lines in political cohesion and military responsiveness. Interpretively, the phubbing system's evolution demonstrates the interplay between demographic trends, administrative policy, and frontier imperatives. Initially designed for efficiency and integration, the militia model depended on stable local populations and precise land and census management. When these assumptions were disrupted by population growth, land redistribution, or prolonged campaigns, the system could not adapt without structural reform. The shift to professionalized troops illustrates both the flexibility and the limits of Tang military organization. The empire was capable of sustaining frontier defense, but increasingly at the cost of central control and systemic predictability. In conclusion, the phubbing system, while foundational to early Tang military capacity, underwent a gradual transformation under demographic, economic, and logistical pressures. Documentary and archaeological evidence from the 7th and 8th centuries demonstrate the weakening of rotational militia practices, the rise of professional standing units, and the increasing autonomy of regional commanders. These changes set the stage for subsequent military and political challenges, including the emergence of powerful frontier generals and the eventual instability that contributed to internal rebellions. The trajectory of the phubbing system highlights the dynamic interaction between institutional design, population management, and the practical realities of sustaining a vast empire. The weakening of the phubbing system contributed directly to the rise of powerful regional commanders. Regional military governors grew from protective administrators into influential power brokers. The Tang Dynasty's reliance on the phubbing system and its frontier garrisons created the administrative preconditions for the rise of judushi, or regional military governors. Initially conceived as protective administrators overseeing military districts, judushi were tasked with maintaining frontier defense, coordinating troop deployments, and managing local logistics. Early evidence from the Tang Huiyao and frontier communication records indicates that these appointments were intended to integrate regional command into the central bureaucratic framework. Governors received designated revenues to support troops and fortifications, while remaining subject to imperial oversight through reporting requirements and periodic evaluations. The system allowed the Tang state to extend its military reach across the vast northern, western, and southwestern frontiers without permanently stationing central officials in distant provinces. The delegation of fiscal and military authority to judushi was initially effective in stabilizing border regions. Governors collected taxes specifically earmarked for troop maintenance, oversaw supply distribution, and coordinated recruitment from local populations. Administrative correspondence preserved in Dunhuang and Xi'an archives demonstrates that early judushi were accountable to both the central court and the local command hierarchy, ensuring alignment between frontier defense and imperial strategy. The arrangement combined efficiency with strategic flexibility. By empowering governors with localized decision-making, the Tang state could respond to frontier incursions and nomadic pressures more rapidly than a wholly centralized model would permit. Over time, however, the system began to shift the locus of authority away from the central government. The demographic and logistical pressures that had weakened the Fubing militia meant that Jidushi increasingly controlled professionalized standing troops, permanent garrison facilities, and substantial local revenue streams. Unlike their predecessors, who were rotating militia commanders dependent on central oversight, these governors could independently sustain their military and administrative functions. Frontier correspondence indicates that some Jidushi began issuing orders, allocating resources, and negotiating with neighboring states without prior approval from Chang'an, marking a gradual but significant decentralization of authority. Fiscal autonomy reinforced this political power. Records show that Jidushi were entrusted with local taxation and resource allocation to maintain their garrisons and administrative offices. The combination of military command and revenue control allowed governors to act with a degree of independence that rivaled or exceeded that of central officials. Administrative memorials from the mid-8th century report disputes between the court and influential Jidushi over troop deployments and fiscal surplus, illustrating the tension between central oversight and local authority. In effect, the institutional design that initially strengthened frontier security also created a structural avenue for semi-autonomous power accumulation. An illustrative example of this evolution is in Lushan, who rose through the ranks as a Jidushi commanding multiple frontier districts in the northeast. Archival records and biographies indicate that in Lushan was initially appointed to manage both military operations and fiscal administration in strategic border zones. His control over garrisons, trade routes, and revenue streams allowed him to consolidate political influence beyond the scope of a typical provincial governor. By coordinating both army movements and local economic resources, he effectively operated as a quasi-independent ruler, highlighting the latent potential of the Jidushi system to transform from defensive administration into political power centers. The structural evolution of Jidushi power can be understood through three interconnected factors. First, military professionalization reduced reliance on central Fubing oversight, creating permanent troops loyal primarily to their governor. Second, fiscal delegation gave Jidushi discretionary control over local revenue and provisioning, enabling independent decision-making. Third, geographic distance from Chang'an compounded the effects of decentralization, as frontier communication was slow, incomplete, or occasionally circumvented. Together, these factors allowed governors to accumulate political influence while formally remaining subordinate to the imperial court. This decentralization did not occur uniformly. Some Jidushi remained loyal administrators, efficiently integrating local defense and taxation into the Tang state's broader objectives. Others, however, leveraged structural autonomy to build personal networks of military officers, local elites, and merchant collaborators. Communication logs and memorials record instances in which governors petitioned the court for extraordinary authority, retained surplus revenue, or conducted diplomatic initiatives independently. These semi-autonomous actions reflect both the flexibility and the latent instability embedded within the Tang military administrative framework. The rise of Jidushi illustrates the interaction between institutional design and practical constraints. Originally intended to strengthen frontier defense, the system became adaptive to local conditions, allowing for rapid response to external threats but simultaneously creating potential fissures in central control. Tang historiography emphasizes this duality. The central government recognized the effectiveness of empowered governors, but also recorded anxieties regarding their growing independence. Such structural ambivalence set the stage for political rupture when a particularly ambitious or capable Jidushi could marshal sufficient military, fiscal, and political resources to challenge imperial authority. By the 740s, the Tang court faced a delicate balance. On one hand, frontier defense required competent, locally empowered commanders. On the other, excessive autonomy undermined the hierarchical authority that had traditionally stabilized the empire. Communication records reveal repeated court instructions attempting to standardize reporting, rotate command, or limit fiscal discretion. These efforts met mixed success, as governors often cited operational necessity to justify deviations from central directives. This tension between centralization and local autonomy exemplifies the institutional challenge inherent in sustaining a vast empire over diverse and distant territories. And Lushan's eventual rebellion in 755 CE represents the culmination of these systemic trends. His position as a highly empowered judushi, with control over troops, fiscal resources, and frontier infrastructure, allowed him to challenge the central court decisively. Historical analyses, including official chronicles and memorials, underscore that the Tang government's reliance on judushi for frontier security created structural vulnerabilities. The very governors who had maintained imperial stability could, under certain circumstances, mobilize sufficient independent power to threaten the dynasty itself. Thus, the emergence of judushi illustrates both the functional utility and latent instability of decentralized military governance. In conclusion, the rise of judushi transformed the nature of Tang political and military authority. Initially conceived as protective administrators, regional governors acquired autonomous fiscal, military, and administrative power that gradually shifted the balance between central and local authority. Archival records, frontier communications, and the biography of An Lushan demonstrate how this system strengthened the empire's borders while simultaneously embedding structural vulnerabilities within imperial governance. The evolution of judushi power highlights the intricate relationship between institutional design, regional exigencies, and political stability, providing a critical context for understanding the mid-8th century challenges that reshaped the Tang state. The increasing autonomy of frontier commanders set the conditions for a major political rupture. In 755 CE, decades of administrative tension and frontier militarization converged into a single crisis. The An Lushan rebellion emerged from a combination of long-term structural pressures within the Tang state, demographic changes, fiscal imbalances, and the evolving military system. By the mid-8th century, the Tang Dynasty had experienced decades of administrative centralization interwoven with increasing delegation of power to frontier commanders, particularly the judushi. While this system had enabled effective defense and rapid response to external threats, it also created semi-autonomous military authorities capable of exerting significant political influence. Frontier dispatches, preserved in Dunhuang archives, record repeated petitions by regional governors for extraordinary fiscal and troop management powers, demonstrating the gradual accumulation of local autonomy. These semi-independent military domains provided the organizational foundation for An Lushan's later mobilization. Demographic and economic pressures compounded structural vulnerabilities. Census and tax registers indicate population growth and urban migration in the northern plains, which intensified local competition for arable land and fiscal obligations. Frontier garrisons increasingly relied on standing professional troops rather than the rotating phubbing militia, requiring predictable revenue streams and secure supply chains. Letters and reports from frontier administrators document growing tension between the demands of the state and the capacities of local populations, creating persistent friction that destabilized both civil and military governance. The combination of expanding fiscal obligations and limited land resources strained the Tang administration and heightened vulnerability to rebellion. Political factionalism at the imperial court further exacerbated the situation. The High Tang bureaucracy, while sophisticated and highly structured, had developed competing power blocks aligned with prominent ministers, eunuchs, and members of the royal family. Memorials and court records from the 740s and early 750s show frequent disputes over policy, appointments, and military command. These internal divisions limited the court's capacity to enforce consistent oversight of frontier commanders and undermined the implementation of standardized fiscal and military regulations. Consequently, governors such as An Lushan could exploit court indecision to consolidate both local and multi-ethnic military power. An Lushan's career illustrates the convergence of structural and personal factors leading to rebellion. A general of Sogdian and Turkic descent, he rose rapidly through the ranks due to frontier experience, charisma, and familial alliances. Archival evidence indicates that An Lushan commanded multiple garrisons across the northeast, including the strategically critical Hubei region, giving him control over significant manpower, supply depots, and fortified positions. His command structure integrated Han Chinese, Turkic, and other ethnic troops, reflecting the Tang state's reliance on multi-ethnic frontier armies for both defense and expansion. This diversity enhanced operational capacity but also reduced loyalty to central authority, creating an organizational environment conducive to autonomous action. Fiscal imbalances played a critical role in setting the stage for rebellion. Frontier governors were granted direct control over tax revenues to maintain garrisons and supply lines. Over time, these allocations became effectively independent from central oversight, allowing governors to accumulate surplus wealth. Tang administrative records, including memorials and fiscal reports, document repeated imperial attempts to regulate these funds and redirect revenues, often meeting resistance or evasion by local commanders. The resulting financial autonomy contributed directly to the capacity of governors like in Lushan to finance large-scale military operations without immediate reliance on the court. The weakening of the phubbing system and the professionalization of military forces also created structural vulnerabilities. Rotating militia practices had ensured direct ties between soldiers and the central bureaucracy, but standing troops were increasingly loyal to their immediate commander rather than to the emperor. Military registers and frontier deployment logs from the mid-8th century show that garrisons were consolidated under permanent command structures, with officers receiving direct pay and provisions from their judushi. This shift not only enhanced operational efficiency but also enabled ambitious generals to act independently, controlling both troop movements and logistical support, an essential factor in Lushan's capacity to launch a rebellion of unprecedented scale. Regional insecurity and external threats compounded internal fragility. Tang relations with the Tibetan Empire, the Uyghur Khanate, and steppe nomads demanded constant frontier vigilance. Military communications indicate that governors were given broad discretionary authority to respond to raids, negotiate with local leaders, and manage strategic passes. While this delegation was effective in deterring incursions, it also reinforced the independence of frontier commanders and normalized semi-autonomous military decision-making, weakening centralized command structures. The combination of local autonomy, ethnic diversity in troops, and logistical control created the conditions for rebellion when an ambitious governor chose to challenge imperial authority. Interpretively, the rebellion can be seen as the result of an interaction between structural institutional trends and individual agency. Tang administrative policies, particularly the delegation of military and fiscal authority to judushi, were rational responses to practical challenges of frontier defense and empire-wide governance. Yet these same policies inadvertently empowered commanders with sufficient resources and organizational infrastructure to challenge central authority. In Lushan's ethnic background, frontier experience, and command over multi-ethnic armies illustrate how personal factors interacted with structural conditions to generate a crisis. The rebellion was thus not merely a product of personal ambition but the logical outcome of systemic pressures within the Tang state. Archaeological evidence supports this analysis. Excavations of northern garrison sites and frontier fortifications reveal extensive logistical preparations, including food storage, armament caches, and fortified compounds capable of sustaining prolonged military operations. These material infrastructures, combined with the professionalization of troops and fiscal autonomy of governors, provided the necessary resources for Lushan's uprising. In this context, rebellion can be understood as a consequence of both institutional design and frontier pragmatics rather than solely individual malfeasance or political intrigue. In conclusion, the causes of the Lushan rebellion were deeply rooted in administrative structure, fiscal policy, military organization, and demographic trends. Frontier militarization, delegated authority to judushi, weakening of the phubbing system, and court factionalism created a state in which ambitious commanders could operate semi-independently. And Lushan's career exemplifies the structural dynamics enabling rebellion. His command of multi-ethnic armies, access to fiscal resources, and strategic positioning along the northeastern frontier combined to create conditions for a large-scale political rupture. By examining these systemic factors, the rebellion can be contextualized as the outcome of long-term institutional evolution rather than an isolated episode of insurrection. With the uprising underway, the Tang state faced a prolonged military and political struggle. For nearly 8 years, the Tang court fought to regain control of its core territories. The Lushan Rebellion, which erupted in 755 CE, rapidly destabilized the Tang state, culminating in the capture of Luoyang in late 756 and the fall of Chang'an shortly thereafter. Contemporary chronicles, including the Zizhi Tongjian and memorials preserved in the Old Book of Tang, provide detailed accounts of the initial uprising. Lushan's forces, composed of multi-ethnic troops from the northeastern frontier, capitalized on rapid mobility and coordinated attacks on key administrative centers. Battlefield reports indicate that the Tang court's initial response was hampered by undermanned garrisons, logistical delays, and the absence of experienced commanders in critical regions. Excavation layers in Luoyang corroborate written records, revealing widespread destruction of administrative buildings, residential districts, and fortifications consistent with rapid military occupation and urban combat. The fall of Chang'an in 756 represented a profound crisis for the Tang administration. The capital, temporarily abandoned by Emperor Xuanzang, suffered significant infrastructural damage and administrative collapse. Contemporary accounts document the displacement of court officials, seizure of treasury resources, and disruption of civil service operations. In response, the court established temporary command centers in Shaanxi and Hunan, attempting to maintain bureaucratic continuity and coordinate counteroffensives. Memorials and garrison logs indicate that local prefects and remaining loyal generals were tasked with rallying troops, provisioning forces, and defending strategic river crossings, highlighting the interplay between civil administration and military operations during a period of systemic crisis. Tang countermeasures relied heavily on alliances with external powers, particularly the Uyghur Khaganate. Diplomatic correspondence and military dispatches reveal that the court negotiated the provision of cavalry troops in exchange for tribute and trade concessions. Uyghur cavalry proved decisive in several key battles, including the recapture of Luoyang in 757 and subsequent engagements near Tong Pass. Military reports describe the coordination of Tang and Uyghur units, illustrating the logistical complexity of integrating foreign troops into the imperial command structure. These alliances, while effective in restoring territorial control, also underscored the dynasty's dependence on external military actors due to the weakened phubbing system and undermanned central garrisons. Administrative collapse across central provinces compounded the military challenge. Provincial records indicate widespread breakdowns in tax collection, law enforcement, and local governance. Refugee populations increased dramatically, and supply chains for loyalist troops were disrupted by both rebel occupation and local unrest. Tang administrators faced the dual task of mobilizing reinforcements while simultaneously reconstructing civil authority. Excavation evidence from Chang'an shows patterns of rebuilding over layers of fire-damaged structures, suggesting continuous administrative activity even during periods of military uncertainty. These findings illustrate the simultaneous military and bureaucratic pressures that define the Tang response. The rebellion was characterized by prolonged campaigns with fluctuating territorial control. Lushan's successor, Shi Siming, maintained control over northern and central provinces, extending operations into Hunan and Shaanxi. Tang generals, including Guizi and Li Guangbi, led systematic counteroffensives, gradually restoring core regions through a combination of siege warfare, field engagements, and strategic fortification. Contemporary memorials emphasize the importance of securing river valleys, mountain passes, and supply depots, reflecting the centrality of logistics in the campaign. Battle reports indicate high attrition on both sides, with repeated shifts in control over towns and fortifications, demonstrating the protracted nature of the conflict. The military campaigns also reveal the impact of frontier troops and Jidushi on the course of the rebellion. Regional commanders who had accumulated semi-autonomous authority were both essential to the Tang counteroffensive and potential sources of internal tension. Dispatches show that coordination among these generals required negotiation and oversight, as some sought to maximize personal gain while others adhered strictly to imperial directives. The rebellion thus highlights the complex interplay between central command, semi-autonomous regional forces, and external allies in sustaining a protracted military campaign. Archaeological and textual evidence together illustrate the human and material costs of the rebellion. Excavated fortifications, armaments, and siege implements document the intensity of combat, while mass graves and contemporaneous chronicles record the scale of casualties and displacement. Food shortages, disease, and disrupted local economies compounded the effects of military action, emphasizing the interdependence of logistical infrastructure, population management, and strategic planning. Tang fiscal documents from the period show extraordinary expenditures to fund both imperial forces and Uyghur auxiliaries, reflecting the economic strain imposed by the prolonged conflict. Interpretively, the course of the rebellion demonstrates the structural vulnerability created by decentralization and frontier militarization. The semi-autonomous authority of Jidushi, the reliance on foreign cavalry, and the weakened phubbing system collectively constrained the Tang court's operational flexibility. Yet these same structures were also instrumental in restoring imperial control. Regional commanders, local garrisons, and foreign allies were essential in recapturing major urban centers and defending critical communication routes. The rebellion thus underscores the dual-edged nature of military delegation within a vast imperial system, where empowerment of local authority can simultaneously produce resilience and systemic risk. By 763 CE, after nearly 8 years of conflict, the Tang court had regained nominal control over the core territories of Luoyang and Chang'an. The campaigns revealed both the effectiveness and the limitations of the empire's military institutions. While decisive engagements and strategic alliances allowed the dynasty to survive, the destruction of infrastructure, depopulation of central provinces, and empowerment of regional commanders permanently altered the administrative and military balance. Memorials and subsequent legal codifications reflect deliberate attempts to reinforce central authority and prevent future concentration of regional power, demonstrating the long-term institutional consequences of the rebellion. In conclusion, the military and administrative response to the Lushan rebellion was defined by the interaction of logistical complexity, frontier alliances, semi-autonomous commanders, and sustained military campaigns. Excavation evidence, battlefield reports, and official chronicles collectively reconstruct a conflict in which the Tang court faced both operational and bureaucratic collapse. While the rebellion was eventually suppressed, the prolonged struggle revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in the delegation of authority to frontier governors and highlighted the challenges of maintaining centralized control across a geographically extensive and socio-politically diverse empire. Although the rebellion was eventually suppressed, its consequences reshaped the structure of the empire. The rebellion permanently altered the balance between central governance and regional power. The aftermath of the Lushan rebellion left the Tang state profoundly weakened in both demographic and institutional terms. Census records from the mid-8th century indicate a substantial population decline in the northern and central plains, with some regions losing up to 1/3 of their inhabitants due to warfare, famine, and disease. Excavation layers in Luoyang and Chang'an confirm widespread urban destruction, including collapsed fortifications, burned administrative complexes, and abandoned residential districts. Agricultural production, already strained by pre-existing land pressure and population growth, fell sharply as labor shortages disrupted sowing, irrigation, and harvest cycles. Land registry documents reveal a notable decrease in cultivated acreage, resulting in decreased fiscal revenue and increased reliance on local elites to manage rural production. Fiscal strain forced the Tang court to implement extraordinary measures to stabilize the state. Surviving treasury records and tax registers indicate that imperial authorities increased reliance on regional Jidushi for both revenue collection and military provisioning. These governors, empowered by necessity during the rebellion, retained considerable control over local taxation and garrison resources in the post-rebellion period. While the court attempted to reassert authority through decrees limiting Jidushi fiscal autonomy, the geographic and logistical realities of the empire made complete enforcement difficult. Consequently, central authority was substantially reduced, and the semi-autonomous power of frontier and provincial commanders became a structural feature of the late Tang state. The rebellion also reshaped the military landscape. The phubbing system, already under stress prior to 755 CE, had been irreversibly weakened. Post-rebellion military records document a continued shift toward professional standing armies, directly funded and commanded by regional authorities rather than through centrally rotated militia. These professional forces were more effective in immediate operational terms but tied loyalty to local governors rather than the imperial center. The Tang court supplemented these forces with alliances, mercenary units, and Uyghur auxiliaries, reflecting the ongoing dependency on external and semi-autonomous actors to maintain territorial integrity. Military reforms attempted to standardize command and improve loyalty, but the rebellion had revealed the structural vulnerability inherent in decentralized frontier defense. Politically, the rebellion accelerated regionalization of authority. Memorials and administrative reports from the late 8th century indicate that many Jadushi retained de facto autonomy over taxation, troop deployment, and local appointments. While some governors remained loyal to the court, others acted independently, occasionally negotiating with rival powers or asserting hereditary control over their territories. This shift altered the traditional Confucian hierarchy of civil-military relations, embedding a dual authority system in which the court maintained symbolic and legislative primacy, while practical governance was mediated through powerful regional actors. Scholars interpret this realignment as a key factor in the increasing fragmentation of Tang political authority during the 9th century. Economic consequences were equally profound. Trade networks, particularly along the Yellow River and Silk Road corridors, suffered significant disruption during the rebellion. Market registers and merchant guild records indicate that urban commercial activity collapsed in major northern centers, while coastal and southern ports absorbed increased economic activity. Land concentration intensified, as wealthy elites acquired abandoned or confiscated holdings, and smaller landholders faced heightened vulnerability. These shifts are documented in land sale records, tax assessments, and administrative correspondence, revealing an increase in social stratification and regional economic disparities. The fiscal base of the central government was therefore constrained both by population loss and by the redistribution of land and revenue to semi-autonomous local powers. Culturally and administratively, the rebellion reinforced the centrality of bureaucratic pragmatism over dynastic ritual. Tang administrative manuals, memorials, and law codes from the post-rebellion period show a focus on stabilizing governance, streamlining taxation, and ensuring military readiness. Imperial decrees prioritized effective coordination with Jadushi, including regular reporting requirements and selective rotation of offices. Nevertheless, archival evidence demonstrates the limits of these reforms. Regional commanders maintained entrenched local influence, often circumventing central directives through operational necessity or personal networks. The structural lesson of the rebellion thus extended beyond immediate devastation, permanently reshaping the balance between institutional authority and frontier power. An interpretive assessment underscores the long-term systemic consequences. The rebellion did not merely constitute a temporary crisis. It transformed the empire's demographic, military, fiscal, and political configuration. Historical data suggest that subsequent Tang emperors were constrained in their ability to implement reforms that fully restored pre-755 centralized control. Instead, the court operated within a modified framework, negotiating with empowered regional authorities and balancing internal factional pressures. In effect, the post-rebellion Tang state became a hybrid system in which nominal imperial authority coexisted with entrenched semi-autonomous governance structures. The demographic and economic disruptions also had cascading effects on social mobility and rural governance. With centralized oversight diminished, local elites gained influence over tax collection, land management, and militia organization. Archaeological surveys of northern and central provinces reveal patterns of fortified village settlements and localized defensive structures, reflecting the population's response to prolonged insecurity. These local adaptations were both a product of imperial weakness and a factor reinforcing regional autonomy. Tang administration manuals and memorials indicate that the court recognized these patterns but was unable to fully reverse them, highlighting the enduring structural impact of the rebellion on the empire's internal cohesion. In conclusion, the Lushan rebellion permanently altered the Tang state. The combination of demographic loss, agricultural devastation, fiscal decentralization, military restructuring, and regional political empowerment reshaped imperial governance and set the stage for late Tang fragmentation. Census data, fiscal registers, and administrative correspondence collectively document the limits of central authority in the post-rebellion period. The semi-autonomous judici, the reliance on professionalized military forces, and the redistribution of economic power created a new equilibrium in which the court maintained symbolic and legislative primacy, while practical authority was increasingly mediated through regional actors. This realignment established the structural conditions that defined the Tang Dynasty's political landscape for the remainder of the 8th and 9th centuries. With weakened central authority, the post-rebellion Tang entered a new political landscape. In the post-rebellion era, palace eunuchs emerged as major political actors within the Tang administrative system. The late Tang dynasty witnessed a marked shift in internal political authority, characterized by the increasing prominence of palace eunuchs. Traditionally restricted to court service and palace management, eunuchs gradually assumed command over critical instruments of imperial administration. This expansion of influence was facilitated by structural vulnerabilities exposed during the Lushan Rebellion, when the central government relied on trusted palace insiders to coordinate communication, manage supplies, and oversee the deployment of troops. Memorials and administrative critiques preserved in the Tang Huiyao document repeated instances in which eunuchs supervised the transfer of funds, the mobilization of regional armies, and the dissemination of imperial orders, highlighting their operational centrality. Eunuchs occupied a unique administrative niche that bridged civil and military authority. Unlike scholar officials, whose careers depended on the imperial examination system and bureaucratic hierarchy, eunuchs operated through proximity to the emperor. This position allowed them to control palace communications, manage confidential information, and arbitrate access to the sovereign. Court edicts indicate that eunuchs frequently supervised personnel appointments, prepared official documents for signature, and monitored the enforcement of imperial decrees. Their roles in both daily governance and extraordinary military emergencies positioned them as indispensable intermediaries between the emperor and provincial authorities. The reliance on eunuchs intensified in the context of factionalized civil service politics. Following the Lushan Rebellion, scholar officials increasingly competed for influence within the court, forming factions aligned with key ministers, imperial relatives, or regional interests. Eunuchs, by contrast, were directly accountable to the emperor and unencumbered by civil service hierarchies. Administrative critiques preserved in the Tang Huiyao describe occasions in which eunuchs mediated factional disputes, executed personnel rotations, and ensured loyalty to the throne. This mediation enhanced their indispensability, allowing them to consolidate authority over key aspects of the imperial administration, including fiscal oversight and military command. Fiscal administration was a particularly important domain in which eunuchs exercised power. Treasury reports and memorials indicate that eunuchs supervised the allocation of funds to regional judici, the management of state granaries, and the transfer of revenues to the capital. By controlling these financial flows, eunuchs could influence both military readiness and the stability of local administrations. In some cases, they acted as arbiters of provincial taxation, determining the timing and allocation of levies to meet imperial and military requirements. This financial authority not only reinforced their political influence, but also positioned them as essential actors in sustaining the operational capacity of the post-rebellion Tang state. The structural logic behind eunuch empowerment is evident in their role as intermediaries during periods of political instability. After the rebellion, the central government faced ongoing challenges in coordinating semi-autonomous judici, maintaining loyalty among professionalized military units, and managing a fractured civil bureaucracy. Eunuchs, operating within the palace and directly accountable to the emperor, provided a mechanism to centralize control without relying exclusively on scholar officials or regional commanders. Military dispatches and palace records illustrate instances in which eunuchs oversaw the movement of troops, monitored frontier compliance, and coordinated emergency responses to local disturbances. Their ability to act as immediate executors of imperial policy underlines the administrative rationale for their elevated role. Eunuchs also leveraged their institutional position to expand influence over military appointments. Memorials and edicts document repeated cases in which eunuchs recommended or approved the promotion of generals, supervised army rotations, and mediated disputes between regional commanders. This control was particularly consequential given the post-rebellion decentralization of military authority. Professional armies stationed under semi-autonomous judici required coordination with the central court, and eunuchs, acting as intermediaries, could influence loyalty, deployment, and operational effectiveness. Archival correspondence confirms that eunuch oversight often determined the pace and direction of military campaigns, reflecting the extent to which their administrative authority had become intertwined with Tang military strategy. Political historians have noted that the rise of eunuch influence was not simply a product of personal ambition but the outcome of systemic pressures. The Tang state's reliance on direct imperial intermediaries arose from the need to manage a geographically extensive and factionalized empire. Scholar officials, constrained by examination hierarchies and factional alliances, were often less responsive to immediate operational requirements. By contrast, eunuchs' proximity to the emperor and control over palace channels allowed rapid decision-making and coordination. Contemporary critiques, preserved in memorials, acknowledge both the effectiveness of this arrangement and the potential risks posed by the concentration of power in unelected palace personnel. Eunuch authority also intersected with court ritual and symbolic functions. Records indicate that eunuchs supervised imperial ceremonies, controlled access to the throne, and administered palace guard units. This combination of ceremonial, administrative, and military responsibilities reinforced their centrality to governance. Their oversight of ritual processes ensured that symbolic legitimacy remained aligned with the emperor, while practical management of palace and military operations provided tangible influence over policy execution. In effect, eunuchs operated as a bridge between symbolic authority and operational administration, a position that extended far beyond traditional household management. The consolidation of eunuch power was further amplified by personal loyalty networks. Unlike scholar officials, whose careers were tied to meritocratic promotion and factional competition, eunuchs' advancement depended primarily on imperial favor. Palace archives and personnel registers document instances of patronage, mentoring, and strategic placement of junior eunuchs to maintain influence across administrative and military domains. These networks enabled continuity of authority and enhanced the capacity of eunuchs to influence appointments, decisions, and resource allocation, creating a durable administrative bloc within the court. By the late 8th century, the eunuch presence in Tang governance had become institutionalized. Memorials and administrative reports consistently note their participation in fiscal oversight, military supervision, and court management. While their prominence was occasionally contested by scholar officials or regional governors, the structural dependence of the court on eunuch intermediaries made their influence persistent. This dual role, operational executor and symbolic intermediary, ensured that eunuchs remained central actors in shaping late Tang policy, reinforcing both administrative efficiency and a new distribution of power within the empire. Interpretively, the rise of eunuchs illustrates the structural adaptation of the Tang bureaucracy to post-rebellion realities. The combination of decentralized military authority, semi-autonomous regional governors, and factionalized civil administration created a vacuum of immediate executive control. Eunuchs, operating within the palace and accountable directly to the emperor, filled this vacuum, effectively mediating between central policy, military logistics, and factional competition. Their ascendancy thus represents a systemic solution to the practical challenges of governance rather than merely a personal accumulation of power. In conclusion, the post-rebellion era of the Tang Dynasty demonstrates how institutional roles can expand in response to structural necessity. Eunuchs, initially confined to palace management, became central actors in administration, finance, and military coordination. Archival evidence from the Tang Huiyao, palace memorials, and military dispatches documents their pervasive influence across court operations. Their authority, while sometimes contested, reflected the structural pressures of governing a geographically expansive, factionalized, and militarily decentralized empire. The rise of eunuchs therefore constitutes a critical dimension of late Tang political evolution, establishing the framework within which subsequent court factionalism and regional autonomy operated. The rise of eunuchs intersected with increasing factional divisions among scholar officials. Late Tang politics became increasingly defined by structured factional alignments among scholar officials. In the decades following the Lushan Rebellion, the Tang administration faced significant challenges in maintaining coherent governance across an empire weakened by demographic loss, economic disruption, and the empowerment of regional commanders. One prominent feature of this period was the development of bureaucratic factions within the scholar official class, particularly the divisions later formalized as the Nyo Ali factions. Memorials, examination records, and personnel registers indicate that these alignments emerged from a combination of ideological differences, competition for high office, and regional loyalties. The Nyo Ali factional conflict illustrates the structural dynamics of bureaucratic competition in the late Tang. Members of the Nyo faction generally derived from the southern prefectures, emphasizing reformist or populist approaches to civil service management. They advocated for meritocratic selection processes and often aligned with officials who favored centralization and bureaucratic oversight of regional authorities. Conversely, the Li faction was composed primarily of northern elites, many of whom had familial ties to the pre-rebellion administrative hierarchy and emphasized stability, aristocratic privilege, and the continuity of established bureaucratic practices. Examination records and personnel rosters reveal consistent patterns of factional alignment, indicating that appointments, promotions, and legal responsibilities were increasingly influenced by factional affiliation rather than strictly by merit or seniority. The institutional basis for factionalism was embedded in the civil service examination system. Records from examination rosters and court memorials show that candidates from certain provincial or familial networks were systematically favored by patrons aligned with specific factions. These networks extended into regional administrations, creating overlapping channels of influence between the capital and the provinces. Ideological alignment, expressed through policy recommendations, legal interpretations, and administrative memos, often reinforced factional identity. For instance, scholars associated with the Nyo faction favored measures to improve revenue collection and reassert central oversight over Jidushi, while Li-aligned officials emphasized aristocratic consultation and respect for established local autonomy. This divergence in approach illustrates the structural pressures within a bureaucratic system attempting to govern a semi-decentralized empire. Factional competition frequently undermined administrative efficiency. Memorials and court edicts detail delays in policy implementation resulting from factional disputes over personnel appointments, fiscal measures, and military provisioning. In some instances, conflicting recommendations from Nyo and Li officials led to repeated revisions of legal codes, tax schedules, and military directives. Archival correspondence indicates that factionalism also affected coordination between central and provincial administrations, as local governors selectively implemented policies aligned with their factional allies in the capital. The cumulative effect was a bureaucratic environment in which ideological and regional loyalty could outweigh operational necessity, reflecting a structural tension between centralized authority and the personal networks of scholar officials. Despite these challenges, factionalism had practical origins and functional rationales. The Tang state relied on a highly educated bureaucracy to manage complex administrative, fiscal, and legal responsibilities across a vast and geographically diverse territory. The presence of multiple policy factions provided channels for debate, alternative perspectives, and checks on unilateral policymaking. Memorials preserved in the Tang Huiyao note instances in which factional criticism prevented excessive centralization or overreach by individual ministers. From a structural perspective, factions operated as semi-institutionalized mechanisms for policy deliberation, albeit with the side effect of polarizing administrative decision-making. Regional backgrounds and career trajectories contributed to the persistence of factional alignment. Officials from northern prefectures with closer historical ties to the pre-rebellion Tang elite tended to cluster in ministries dealing with finance, law, and military administration. Southern officials, often less connected to aristocratic networks, populated offices overseeing examinations, civil personnel management, and provincial audit functions. Examination records, personnel rotations, and memorials illustrate how these regional concentrations reinforced factional solidarity, producing long-term patterns of bureaucratic polarization. These patterns extended beyond the capital, influencing provincial appointments, revenue collection, and military coordination. The ideological content of factionalism also reflected debates over administrative philosophy. Neo-aligned scholars often argued for strict oversight of judici and enhanced central control over taxation and troop deployment. Li-aligned officials prioritized aristocratic consultation, legal continuity, and measured reform, sometimes resisting aggressive centralization. Memorials and policy drafts preserved from the late 8th century provide concrete evidence of these debates, showing detailed discussions of fiscal allocation, frontier garrison rotation, and personnel merit assessment. While factional arguments were framed in normative terms, they also corresponded to material interests, control over appointments, access to provincial revenues, and influence over military assignments. Factional competition frequently intersected with the rise of palace eunuchs, creating complex power dynamics. Memorials document that eunuchs, controlling court communication and access to the emperor, could mediate factional disputes or exploit divisions to advance personal influence. In some cases, officials from opposing factions sought eunuch support to secure appointments, reinforcing the structural interdependence between scholar officials and palace intermediaries. These interactions further complicated policy implementation, as the authority of central ministers depended both on bureaucratic hierarchy and on their ability to navigate factional alliances. The long-term effects of factionalization were evident in both political and administrative outcomes. Policy implementation slowed as ministers contested decisions along factional lines, delaying revenue collection, military provisioning, and legal codification. Provincial administration became partially factionalized, as regional governors aligned themselves with capital-based factions to secure resources or legitimize authority. The resulting bureaucratic polarization, documented in memorials and personnel registers, contributed to the gradual decentralization of power that characterized the late Tang political landscape. At the same time, factionalism shaped elite recruitment patterns. Examination records show that candidates from favored networks enjoyed accelerated promotion and preferential postings, reinforcing both factional cohesion and socio-regional stratification. Over successive decades, this selective recruitment reinforced structural differences between northern and southern elites, creating enduring patterns of political alignment and administrative behavior. Scholars interpret these developments as a structural adaptation to the challenges of post-rebellion governance. Factional networks provided a mechanism for talent mobilization while simultaneously constraining unified policy execution. In sum, late Tang factionalism was a product of structural, regional, and institutional forces. The semi-autonomous judici, weakened central authority, and expanded eunuch influence created conditions in which scholar officials relied on factional networks to advance policy, manage appointments, and secure resources. Memorials, examination rosters, and administrative reports collectively illustrate how these alignments shaped both the process and outcome of governance. Factionalization thus represents not merely a feature of personal ambition but a systemic response to the complex operational demands of a geographically extensive and politically fragmented empire. By the end of the 8th century, the persistent alignment of scholar officials into competing factions had normalized within the administrative culture of the Tang court. While factional disputes often slowed decision-making and reduced efficiency, they also provided structured channels for elite participation and policy deliberation. This dual nature, both constraining and functional, underscores the importance of understanding factionalism as an analytically significant feature of late Tang political organization rather than as a symptom of mere corruption or instability. Political fragmentation intersected with shifts in economic and regional authority. By the 9th century, Tang economic structures had shifted toward regionalized control and private land concentration. In the late Tang period, the empire's agrarian economy underwent substantial structural transformation. Central to this process was the decline of the equal field Juntian system, a land distribution policy that had underpinned Tang fiscal stability since the early dynasty. Originally designed to allocate land to households proportionally, ensuring equitable taxation and supply of labor for state projects. The system became increasingly difficult to enforce after the Lushan Rebellion. Population dislocations, repeated conflicts, and the rise of powerful regional elites undermined central oversight, creating conditions in which land could be accumulated privately rather than redistributed annually. Land registry documents and tax registers from the 9th century illustrate the emergence of large estates, zongtian, controlled by aristocrats, military governors, and wealthy merchants. These estates often absorbed formerly state-managed fields, reducing the taxable base under direct central administration. Memorials and fiscal reports indicate that estate owners exercised considerable autonomy over tenant labor, rent collection, and agricultural production, while their regional influence allowed them to negotiate reduced obligations to the central government. The combination of territorial control and fiscal leverage reinforced the growing economic independence of local elites, contributing to regional variation in agricultural output and taxation. The regionalization of the economy extended beyond landholding patterns. Archaeological surveys and local fiscal records demonstrate that formerly integrated imperial markets were increasingly supplemented by locally controlled trade networks. Grain storage, transport infrastructure, and market regulation often fell under the authority of local magistrates or gentry, rather than central administrators. This decentralization affected both taxation and state revenue. While the Tang court continued to collect tribute and levy taxes, the efficiency and predictability of these collections declined in areas dominated by powerful landholders. Taxation practices evolved in response to these structural changes. Whereas early Tang administration relied on proportional levies tied to the equal field system, late Tang records show a greater reliance on fixed rents and in-kind contributions from large estates. Regional variation in productivity and land ownership led to uneven fiscal burdens, with central authorities frequently compelled to negotiate reductions or deferments with influential landlords. Memorials from the late 9th century indicate repeated appeals by provincial administrators to the court for guidance on standardizing collections, reflecting the administrative strain imposed by decentralized economic control. The rise of private estates also influenced agricultural patterns and labor organization. Estate owners invested in permanent irrigation works, large-scale crop rotation, and the use of tenant labor, including both freeholders and bonded peasants. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements in the Yangtze and Yellow River regions demonstrates the proliferation of walled estates, storage facilities, and estate-managed workshops. These developments reinforce the separation between local economic management and central oversight, producing a system in which wealth, production, and social influence were increasingly concentrated in regional elites. Economic regionalization also affected population distribution and urban development. Census registers indicate that population growth shifted toward areas with productive large estates and stable local administration, while regions affected by conflict or fiscal extraction experienced stagnation or decline. Markets developed around estate centers, promoting regional trade in grain, textiles, salt, and locally produced goods. Maritime and riverine transport remained critical, particularly in southern provinces, where ports such as Guangzhou and Yangzhou facilitated trade within China and with external partners. Archaeological findings confirm that these commercial hubs were increasingly under local rather than imperial supervision, reflecting the broader trend of decentralized economic authority. The transformation of landholding and taxation intersected with the persistence of semi-autonomous military power. Judushi and local commanders frequently controlled both land and taxation within their jurisdictions, supplementing state revenues with privately collected levies. Fiscal and military records demonstrate that this control allowed regional authorities to maintain armies, fund infrastructure projects, and negotiate directly with the court, often bypassing traditional bureaucratic channels. This interconnection between economic and military authority further reinforced the regionalization of political power in the late Tang period. An interpretive perspective underscores the structural consequences of these changes. The concentration of land and economic control in local hands reduced the Tang court's capacity to implement uniform fiscal policy, maintain state granaries, and mobilize agricultural labor for imperial projects. At the same time, Regionalized estates and markets created localized centers of wealth and production that could absorb population shifts, sustain military garrisons, and facilitate trade even under conditions of weakened central authority. These structural adaptations allowed the Tang state to persist, albeit in a form increasingly defined by decentralized economic control. In conclusion, the late Tang economy was marked by private land accumulation, the erosion of the equal field system, and regionalized fiscal authority. Tax registers, land conveyance documents, and archaeological surveys collectively demonstrate how these processes reshaped agricultural production, local governance, and revenue collection. While central authority retained nominal control over taxation and policy, the practical management of land and resources shifted increasingly to regional elites, setting the stage for both the persistence and the eventual fragmentation of the empire. Economic change paralleled significant religious and cultural developments. In the 9th century, state concerns over wealth, land, and foreign influence shaped religious policy. Religious institutions in the late Tang Dynasty occupied a central position in both the cultural and administrative landscape, yet their prominence increasingly intersected with political and fiscal concerns. Buddhist monasteries, Taoist temples, and associated clerical networks controlled significant landholdings, collected tribute, and often operated independently of regional authorities. Administrative records, stele inscriptions, and monastic land registers indicate that the expansion of religious estates directly impacted the imperial tax base. Monasteries were frequently exempt from taxation, creating a structural imbalance between ecclesiastical wealth and state fiscal needs. These economic dimensions underpinned much of the government's evolving approach to religious policy in the 9th century. Chan Buddhism, emerging as a dominant intellectual and ritual movement, exemplifies the adaptive growth of religious institutions. Surviving records from monastery registries and inscriptions on Dunhuang manuscripts demonstrate the establishment of Chan centers in urban and rural regions, which functioned as both spiritual hubs and administrative nodes for monastic land management. Chan monasteries emphasized meditation practice over doctrinal study, but administratively, they operated like economic units managing labor, agricultural output, and donations. The Tang state observed that these networks, while spiritually influential, also represented centers of wealth and local authority not fully accountable to central governance. Taoism similarly evolved under these conditions. Temple networks and local clerical organizations, recorded in provincial edicts and land conveyance documents, consolidated influence over popular ritual practice and local governance. Taoist institutions occasionally served as intermediaries in civic administration, mediating between local populations and regional authorities, and providing literacy or ritual expertise in support of bureaucratic functions. In doing so, they further complicated the fiscal and administrative landscape, as their estates and personnel were often exempt from standard taxation or corvée obligations. The interaction between religious institutions and the state prompted increasingly regulatory policies during the late Tang. Memorials and edicts from the reign of Emperor Wuzong are 840 to 846 CE emphasize concerns over the concentration of wealth in monasteries and temples, their exemption from taxation, and the potential for foreign religious influence to undermine central authority. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and surviving temple records, confirms that by the early 9th century, Buddhist monasteries controlled extensive lands, particularly in regions such as the Yangtze and Huai River valleys. These estates functioned as local economic centers, sometimes rivaling the influence of regional gentry or semi-autonomous military governors. The suppression of Buddhist institutions in 845 CE, commonly referred to as the Huichang persecution, reflected an administrative rather than doctrinal motivation. State edicts cataloged the number of monasteries, their landholdings, and monastic personnel, mandating the conversion of estates into taxable property and the reintegration of monks and nuns into the workforce. Surviving fiscal records indicate that confiscated lands were redistributed to the state treasury or local governments, reinforcing the central role of economic considerations in religious policy. Importantly, the policy was applied unevenly across regions, highlighting both logistical constraints and the continued semi-autonomous authority of local elites. Monastic responses to policy adjustments demonstrate the adaptive strategies of religious institutions. Epigraphic evidence and temple registers indicate that many monasteries converted administrative functions into charitable or educational roles to retain influence, while some smaller centers realigned under Taoist oversight to avoid direct state taxation. These structural adaptations underscore that religious institutions were not merely passive objects of policy but active participants in the economic and administrative ecosystem of late Tang China. The late Tang state also sought to balance economic control with ideological legitimacy. Edicts and memorials suggest that Wuzong's policies were framed as preserving orthodoxy and protecting the Confucian bureaucratic order, emphasizing the role of religion in supporting, rather than circumventing, state authority. These documents, when compared with stele inscriptions and local gazetteers, show that the state targeted wealth and autonomy rather than spiritual practice per se. In practical terms, religious policy was therefore an instrument for regulating economic resources, reinforcing administrative oversight, and ensuring that influential institutions remained accountable to imperial governance. Regional variation further shaped the effectiveness of these policies. Monastic influence remained strong in frontier provinces and areas with weak fiscal administration, where monasteries could continue land management and local governance relatively independently. Archaeological evidence from southern provinces, including temple foundations and estate layouts, indicates that religious institutions functioned as de facto local administrators, collecting rents, organizing labor, and providing social services. In the capital and surrounding regions, state enforcement was more rigorous, reflecting the proximity of imperial oversight and the presence of palace intermediaries. Interpretively, the evolution of religious policy in the late Tang demonstrates the intersection of fiscal necessity, administrative control, and ideological legitimacy. Buddhism and Taoism were not marginalized due to doctrinal concerns. Rather, their economic and administrative prominence created structural pressures on the central government. The Huichang persecution and related regulatory measures reveal the capacity of the late Tang state to implement corrective policies in response to systemic pressures, though regional enforcement limitations highlight the continued decentralization of power. In conclusion, the late Tang religious landscape reflects a complex administrative ecosystem in which monastic institutions, local elites, and imperial authorities interacted. Stele inscriptions, land registers, and imperial edicts provide evidence that the state's approach was primarily concerned with economic and structural governance, rather than purely spiritual matters. Chan Buddhism, Taoist networks, and monastic estates functioned simultaneously as centers of religious practice, economic production, and local administration. The regulatory interventions of the 9th century, particularly under Emperor Wuzong, illustrate how central authorities sought to integrate these influential institutions into the broader fiscal and political framework, balancing wealth, land, and local influence with the imperatives of state control. Cultural and religious adjustments coincided with increasing regional autonomy. Late Tang China exhibited increasing social mobility alongside growing economic inequality. Urban centers in the late Tang period reflected both the prosperity and structural transformations of the empire. Archaeological surveys of Chang'an, Luoyang, and other major cities indicate that urban growth was sustained despite political decentralization and regional instability. Excavations reveal complex residential layouts, market precincts, and infrastructural planning that accommodated dense populations, while administrative documents provide evidence of municipal regulation, taxation, and market oversight. The resulting urban environment illustrates how demographic expansion, commercial activity, and local governance intersected to shape social organization. One prominent feature of late Tang urban life was the stratification of social classes. Tomb epitaphs, household registries, and census records demonstrate that elites, comprising aristocrats, high-ranking officials, and wealthy merchants, occupied centrally located districts with access to administrative offices and major market centers. Merchants and artisans typically resided in peripheral neighborhoods, often grouped by trade guilds, as indicated by inscriptions detailing family or guild affiliations. Laborers, tenants, and lower-status workers occupied less desirable areas, frequently on the urban outskirts, or in semi-rural settlements integrated into the city's economic orbit. This spatial differentiation mirrored broader patterns of economic inequality emerging from land concentration and regional fiscal autonomy. Economic activity within cities was closely regulated but diverse. Market regulations preserved in local gazetteers and edicts show that central authorities maintained oversight over grain prices, trade tariffs, and guild operations, even as local elites exerted significant influence over commercial transactions. Archaeological evidence from market sites in Chang'an and Luoyang, including weights, measures, and merchant ledgers, indicates that urban trade encompassed both local goods and long-distance imports from the Silk Road. This commercial diversity supported the growing class of urban merchants, who could accumulate wealth independent of land ownership, contributing to increased social mobility for non-aristocratic actors. Population mobility further influenced social transformation. Records from municipal census registers indicate significant migration from rural regions to urban centers, driven by economic opportunity, political instability in the provinces, and the concentration of administrative services in cities. Tomb inscriptions and genealogical records illustrate that many families in urban areas were recent arrivals, including merchants, clerical workers, and artisans, highlighting the permeability of social boundaries. Mobility allowed skilled individuals to rise through bureaucratic, commercial, or artisanal channels, partially offsetting the entrenched privileges of hereditary elites. At the same time, economic and social pressures intensified inequality. Residential surveys and estate inventories reveal that while some non-aristocratic actors could attain wealth, the majority of urban populations remained dependent on labor-intensive occupations or tenancy arrangements. Guild membership or administrative employment could provide economic stability, but systemic vulnerabilities persisted, particularly in areas where regional governors or judici exercised fiscal or military authority over urban districts. Social hierarchies were therefore reinforced by both inherited status and access to economic networks, producing layered urban societies with differential access to resources and administrative influence. Religious and cultural institutions were interwoven with urban life. Temples, monasteries, and shrines not only provided spiritual services but also functioned as centers of education, charity, and local administration. Archaeological findings, including inscriptions and monastic estates integrated into city precincts, demonstrate that religious institutions mediated both social interaction and economic exchange. Monastic involvement in urban markets and land management further reflected the interdependence of spiritual, commercial, and civic structures, shaping patterns of social mobility and hierarchy. The urbanization of late Tang society also influenced family organization and social networks. Tomb epitaphs and genealogical records indicate that extended kinship networks provided mechanisms for economic support, apprenticeship, and political patronage. Elite and non-elite families alike relied on social connections to secure commercial contracts, official appointments, or land tenure. The intersection of familial networks with urban economic structures reinforced social stratification while enabling selective mobility, creating a dynamic yet structured urban social environment. Interpretively, the late Tang urban landscape illustrates the dual nature of social transformation. Economic and demographic expansion fostered opportunities for mobility and wealth accumulation, while institutional and structural factors, land concentration, factionalized governance, and the influence of regional authorities, reinforced inequality and hierarchical differentiation. Material evidence, including residential layouts, market artifacts, and funerary inscriptions, underscores the persistence of structured social roles even as mobility and commercial opportunity expanded. In conclusion, the late Tang period exhibits a complex interaction between urbanization, class formation, and social transformation. Archaeological and documentary evidence demonstrates that cities such as Chang'an and Luoyang functioned as centers of economic production, administrative oversight, and social negotiation. Urban life reflected both the opportunities generated by late Tang prosperity and the limitations imposed by structural inequalities. Markets, residential patterns, population mobility, and institutional affiliations collectively illustrate a society adapting to economic decentralization, shifting fiscal authority, and evolving administrative structures. These internal shifts shaped the final century of Tang political fragmentation. By the 870s, regional military governors held effective control over large territories. In the final centuries of the Tang Dynasty, the political landscape of China was increasingly defined by the autonomy of regional military governors, or jidushi. Originally instituted as frontier commanders responsible for defense against nomadic incursions and local rebellion, jidushi gradually accumulated both military and fiscal authority far beyond their intended remit. Administrative records, frontier dispatches, and fiscal censuses indicate that by the mid-9th century, these governors controlled regional armies, collected taxes, and managed infrastructure projects largely independently of the central court. Their power rested on three structural foundations: control over local troops, jurisdiction over economic resources, and the weakening capacity of the central administration to enforce direct oversight. The military aspect of jidushi authority was central to their autonomy. Frontier registers and garrison reports reveal that each jidushi maintained personally loyal armies, funded through both local taxation and revenues from estate-like military colonies. Over time, these forces became professionalized, distinct from the central phubbing system, which had declined since the Inlushan Rebellion. The ability to command troops independently allowed governors not only to defend their territories but also to pursue political agendas, enforce fiscal policies, and negotiate directly with the imperial court. Documents show that disputes between the court and jidushi were often resolved through negotiation rather than coercion, reflecting the practical limits of imperial authority. Economic control reinforced military independence. Tax reports and estate records demonstrate that jidushi administered local revenue streams with minimal central interference. They could retain surplus grain and silver to fund their garrisons, repair infrastructure, and secure patronage networks. Frontier dispatches from Sichuan, Hebei, and Shandong provinces illustrate that governors often established semi-autonomous fiscal systems, using local administrators to enforce taxation and manage public works. This fiscal autonomy created a structural asymmetry in which the court relied on jidushi for regional stability, yet could not compel them to contribute consistently to imperial projects. The political consequences of jidushi authority extended to succession and governance. Memorials and official edicts indicate that many governors installed family members or trusted associates in key administrative roles, effectively creating hereditary regional dynasties. Such arrangements entrenched local loyalty to the governor rather than to the central state, weakening bureaucratic coherence. Instances of court-sanctioned appointments often served to legitimize pre-existing local power rather than to assert direct control, highlighting the court's dependency on the jidushi for maintaining nominal authority in contested regions. Historical patterns demonstrate that this structural decentralization was cumulative. Census data and frontier reports indicate that successive crises, including localized rebellions, famine, and nomadic incursions, forced the Tang court to tolerate the growing independence of regional military governors. Repeated reliance on jidushi for military intervention created a feedback loop. The more autonomy governors exercised, the more indispensable they became, and the less leverage the central administration possessed. As a result, by the 870s, governors in regions such as Hebei, Shaanxi, and Sichuan effectively controlled taxation, garrison deployment, and local governance, with the court functioning primarily as a legitimizing authority rather than an active administrator. Analytical insights reveal that the rise of jidushi illustrates structural, rather than individual, causes of imperial fragmentation. The delegation of combined military and fiscal authority, once a pragmatic solution for frontier management, generated unintended consequences. A network of semi-autonomous regions, each capable of resisting central directives. Evidence from memorials, edicts, and local reports confirms that the court repeatedly attempted to curtail these powers but often lacked the resources or political leverage to enforce compliance. This pattern underscores a systemic vulnerability in the late Tang administrative model. The integration of defense, finance, and local governance in a single office, without sufficient mechanisms for central accountability. Moreover, the emergence of independent jidushi contributed to the conditions for major internal uprisings. Frontier governors controlled armies capable of mobilizing quickly across provinces, and their economic autonomy provided the logistical resources necessary for rebellion. The late Tang period witnessed a series of mutinies and localized revolts, often led or supported by disaffected Judushi, illustrating how structural decentralization facilitated both defensive resilience and insurgent capability. Administrative correspondence shows that central officials frequently debated strategies for negotiation, appeasement, or punitive action, revealing the practical limits of imperial authority under these conditions. In conclusion, the autonomy of regional military governors represented a decisive structural factor in the decline of Tang imperial authority. Through control of local armies, fiscal independence, and administrative dominance, Judushi established semi-permanent regional power bases. The central court's reliance on their military and economic resources created a reciprocal dependency that limited enforcement capacity, reinforced regional autonomy, and set the stage for widespread political instability. By the late 9th century, these governors were not merely administrative functionaries but central actors in the political fragmentation of the empire, transforming the balance of power in ways that individual leadership changes alone could not reverse. These structural weaknesses contributed to major internal uprisings. The Huangchao uprising marked the most destructive internal revolt since the mid-8th century. The Huangchao Rebellion, 874 to 884 CE, stands as a pivotal event in the final century of the Tang Dynasty, illustrating the convergence of economic stress, regional instability, and administrative weakness. Huangchao, initially a salt merchant from Shandong, leveraged both popular discontent and systemic vulnerabilities to mobilize a substantial insurgent force. Contemporary chronicles, including the Ziji Tongjian and local gazetteers, alongside archaeological excavation layers in Chang'an and Luoyang, provide detailed evidence of widespread destruction, depopulation, and urban disruption. These sources allow for reconstruction of the rebellion's causes, progression, and structural consequences without recourse to sensationalized narrative. Economic pressures were central to the revolt. Tang taxation policies, particularly on essential commodities such as salt, grain, and land, placed significant strain on rural and urban populations. Monastic, aristocratic, and local elite exemptions exacerbated fiscal inequities, documented in regional tax registers and imperial edicts. Prolonged famine in the late 870s, evidenced by provincial population records and famine relief memorials, intensified rural discontent. Huangchao effectively mobilized this discontent by promising redress of local grievances, exploiting both administrative neglect and the vulnerabilities of semi-autonomous Judushi in the north. Archaeological evidence, including abandoned village sites and layers of burned settlements in Shandong, Hunan, and Jiangsu provinces, corroborates the scale of economic disruption. The military and organizational structure of the rebellion also reflected systemic conditions. Huangchao's forces were initially irregular but rapidly incorporated deserters, disaffected soldiers, and bandit groups. Battlefield reports and city memorials indicate that his army employed conventional siege tactics, supplemented by knowledge of local terrain and logistical networks. The fall of Luoyang in 880 CE, followed by the capture of Chang'an in 881 CE, demonstrates the weakness of the late Tang's centralized forces and the inability of regional garrisons under Judushi supervision to contain insurgent mobility. Excavation layers in both capitals reveal widespread urban destruction, including burned administrative buildings, collapsed city walls, and disrupted grain stores, underscoring the material impact of the rebellion on state infrastructure. Administrative consequences were profound. Documents from the Tang court and surviving fiscal reports show that the rebellion paralyzed revenue collection, disrupted census registration, and eroded bureaucratic control over provincial officials. Many local administrators fled or negotiated with Huangchao's forces to protect property and populations, reflecting both the limited reach of central authority and the dependence of the imperial state on compliant local networks. In some regions, the destruction of offices and archives resulted in long-term gaps in governance, further weakening imperial oversight and exacerbating fiscal shortfalls. The social dimension of the rebellion illustrates the intersection of economic strain and popular mobilization. Huangchao drew support from disenfranchised peasants, impoverished urban dwellers, and marginalized ethnic minorities, as indicated by household registers, tomb inscriptions, and regional memorials. His rebellion also targeted elite estates and commercial centers, reflecting both opportunistic looting and structural grievances against monopolized wealth. This pattern demonstrates how systemic economic inequality, when coupled with weakened military oversight, enabled insurgent forces to mobilize effectively across multiple provinces. Interpretively, the Huangchao rebellion highlights the structural fragility of late Tang governance. The rebellion was not merely the result of Huangchao's personal ambition. It was facilitated by the decentralization of military power, regional fiscal autonomy, and the inability of the central bureaucracy to respond effectively to economic crisis. Contemporary chronicles and modern archaeological evidence jointly demonstrate that the Tang state's reliance on semi-autonomous judici, compounded by fiscal imbalance and urban vulnerability, created conditions in which a localized uprising could escalate into a decade-long crisis. The destruction of the capitals was particularly significant. Chang'an and Luoyang, long centers of administrative, economic, and cultural life, suffered extensive urban devastation. Excavations show that entire districts were abandoned, palace and bureaucratic complexes burned, and granaries destroyed, resulting in food shortages and population displacement. The repeated occupation of the capital by insurgent forces undermined imperial legitimacy, signaling to regional governors, merchants, and the population at large that the central state could no longer guarantee order or protection. These developments entrenched the perception of imperial weakness and reinforced the autonomy of local elites and judici. In conclusion, the Huangchao rebellion exemplifies how economic stress, structural decentralization, and administrative incapacity combined to produce the most severe internal crisis of the late Tang period. Records, fiscal data, and archaeological evidence collectively demonstrate that the uprising was both a symptom and a catalyst of systemic decline. While ultimately suppressed, the rebellion permanently weakened the dynasty's ability to project authority, undermined bureaucratic cohesion, and accelerated the fragmentation of the empire into semi-autonomous regional powers. With the capital repeatedly devastated, imperial legitimacy was irreparably weakened. In 907 CE, the Tang Dynasty came to an end after nearly 3 centuries of rule. The final decades of the Tang Dynasty were characterized by the collapse of central authority and the ascendancy of regional military leaders. Following the suppression of the Huangchao rebellion, the dynasty struggled to restore administrative cohesion. Memorials, military dispatches, and provincial reports from this period document a persistent pattern. Judici and warlords exercised de facto control over territories, while the court retained only nominal authority. Regional commanders such as Zhu Wan in the north and Yang Xingmi in the south consolidated both fiscal and military power, often acting independently of imperial directives. Their armies, funded through local taxation and control of economic resources, allowed them to dominate provinces, supplant bureaucratic channels, and influence imperial succession. The court itself exhibited structural weakness. Records from the Tang Huiyao and palace memorials indicate chronic fiscal deficits, undermanned civil offices, and a reduced capacity to enforce law and taxation. Revenues from key regions were intercepted or appropriated by local powers, further diminishing imperial flexibility. Administrative continuity persisted only in fragmented form, with surviving central institutions serving largely ceremonial and symbolic purposes. Contemporary chronicles describe the court's dependence on regional warlords to maintain minimal order, a reliance that both legitimized and reinforced their autonomy. The political maneuvers of Zhu Wan illustrate this transformation. Originally a subordinate commander during the Huangchao rebellion, Zhu Wan leveraged his military position to expand territorial control, eventually controlling the imperial capital and key northern provinces. Documents indicate that he negotiated appointments, manipulated succession, and consolidated both civil and military offices within his command. By the late 900s, Zhu Wan effectively dictated court policy, demonstrating that military dominance had supplanted traditional bureaucratic hierarchies as the primary determinant of political authority. Regional fragmentation extended beyond the north. Military governors in the south and west, including Yang Xingmi, Ma Yin, and Wang Jian, operated semi-independently, exercising control over taxation, conscription, and infrastructure. Records show that their administrations maintained local stability and economic productivity, but no longer recognized central mandates, reflecting the permanent decentralization that had emerged over previous decades. The Tang court's authority thus became largely symbolic, reliant on ritualized recognition rather than enforceable governance. The culmination of this process occurred in 907 CE, when Emperor Ai, the last Tang sovereign, was forced to abdicate in favor of Xuan, who formally established the later Liang dynasty. Memorials and court records from the period describe the abdication as a negotiated transfer of power, reflecting both the impotence of the imperial institution and the structural dominance of military authority. The abdication marked the formal conclusion of nearly 3 centuries of Tang governance, but it also demonstrated continuity in administrative and cultural practices, as Xuan and subsequent regional rulers retained elements of Tang bureaucracy, legal codes, and ceremonial frameworks to legitimize their rule. Interpretively, the final decades of the Tang illustrate how structural weaknesses and decentralized military authority led to the collapse of imperial unity. Evidence demonstrates that dynastic longevity relied not only on institutional continuity but also on the capacity to manage regional military powers and maintain fiscal integrity. Once local commanders controlled both resources and troops, the dynasty's ability to enforce centralized authority was irreversibly compromised. Administrative records and memorials consistently emphasized the limitations faced by the court, highlighting the structural rather than individual nature of collapse. Social and economic conditions also compounded political decline. Census records, tax registers, and fiscal accounts indicate that population displacement, urban depopulation, and disrupted agricultural production undermined state revenues and eroded central capacity. While certain regions remained economically productive under local rule, the inability of the court to extract and redistribute resources weakened both symbolic and practical sovereignty. Archaeological evidence, including abandoned urban sectors and military encampments, corroborates these patterns, illustrating the tangible effects of political fragmentation on material life. In conclusion, the period from 884 to 907 CE demonstrates the final stage of Tang imperial decline as a structural process. The rise of warlord-dominated regions, fiscal insolvency, and administrative fragmentation rendered the central court largely ceremonial. The abdication of Emperor Ai formalized a process that had been underway for decades: the displacement of centralized authority by regional military powers. While the dynasty formally ended, its institutional frameworks, legal codes, and cultural norms persisted, influencing subsequent regimes and maintaining the Tang legacy in East Asia. Although the dynasty collapsed, its long-term influence continued across East Asia. The Tang administrative model became a foundational template across East Asia. The Tang dynasty's administrative innovations left a lasting imprint on governance in China and neighboring regions. Central to this legacy were the 3 departments and 6 ministries system, the codification of law, and the civil service examination framework. The 3 departments, comprising the Secretariat, Chancellery, and Department of State Affairs, structured decision-making and policy review, while the 6 ministries managed personnel, finance, rights, military affairs, justice, and public works. Surviving Tang legal manuscripts, including drafts preserved in Dunhuang and official compilations such as the Tang Lu Shu Yi, demonstrate the level of bureaucratic detail and procedural clarity achieved under the dynasty. Subsequent dynasties, notably the Song and Ming, adapted these structures, refining departmental responsibilities and embedding meritocratic principles into administrative culture. The Tang legal code, finalized under Emperor Xuanzang and further refined in 653 CE, provided a model for both governance and jurisprudence. It balanced criminal, civil, and administrative statutes, integrating Confucian ethical norms with practical governance. Copies of this code, referenced in later dynastic histories and preserved in fragmentary manuscripts, illustrate its procedural sophistication and adaptability. The codification influenced not only Chinese dynasties but also neighboring polities. Japan's Ritsuryo codes, developed during the Nara and Heian periods, drew heavily on Tang statutes, adapting fiscal, penal, and bureaucratic structures to local conditions. Similarly, Korea's Silla and Balhae states incorporated Tang-inspired ministries and provincial frameworks, while Vietnam's early imperial courts modeled taxation and military administration on Tang precedents. The civil service examination system, expanded under Emperor Taizong and Xuanzang, became another cornerstone of Tang influence. Tang records indicate the formalization of merit-based appointments, emphasizing literary competence, administrative knowledge, and familiarity with Confucian classics. Examination rosters, memorials, and personnel files show that candidates from diverse provinces competed for official positions, reinforcing the principle that bureaucratic authority derived from demonstrated skill rather than hereditary privilege. This meritocratic ideal persisted through successive Chinese dynasties and inspired institutional adoption abroad, including in Korea's Guizhou examinations and Japan's court examinations. By emphasizing knowledge, ethical judgment, and administrative competence, the Tang system reinforced a model in which centralized governance depended on both standardized procedures and trained officials, rather than purely personal loyalty. Tang provincial administration also set important precedents. The circuit, Dao, and prefecture, Zhou, systems allowed the central government to manage vast territories efficiently while delegating localized authority to professional administrators. Frontier administration incorporated both civilian and military structures, creating mechanisms to integrate ethnically and culturally diverse populations. Surviving frontier records, such as dispatches from Hebei and Sichuan, illustrate how local officials mediated taxation, conscription, and law enforcement while remaining accountable to central directives. These organizational practices became templates for later Chinese dynasties and provided models for political integration in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, supporting the long-term stability of East Asian imperial governance. Interpretively, the Tang administrative legacy demonstrates the interaction of institutional sophistication and imperial longevity. By codifying procedures, professionalizing the bureaucracy, and combining central oversight with local flexibility, Tang governance enabled the management of vast and diverse territories. Evidence from legal texts, diplomatic records, and institutional histories confirms that this approach was not merely a historical artifact, but a living model actively adapted by successor regimes. The continued use and adaptation of Tang structures highlight the dynasty's role as both a practical and symbolic standard for effective administration in East Asia. In conclusion, Tang administrative and political innovations, spanning legal codification, civil service examinations, departmental organization, and provincial management, established frameworks that shaped governance for centuries. Legal manuscripts, personnel records, and cross-regional adaptations demonstrate that Tang methods transcended the dynasty's lifespan, influencing the institutional architecture of China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. The dynasty's emphasis on procedural clarity, meritocracy, and territorial integration provided a durable template, ensuring that its bureaucratic principles remained central to East Asian statecraft long after the fall of Chang'an. Cultural influence extended as widely as administrative influence. Tang cultural traditions shaped the artistic vocabulary of East Asia for centuries. The Tang dynasty's cultural achievements left an enduring imprint not only within China but across the broader East Asian region. Tang poetry, painting, religious scholarship, and material arts were systematically transmitted to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam through diplomatic missions, scholar exchanges, and the circulation of manuscripts. Surviving documents, including Japanese copies of Tang poetry collections such as the Quan Tangshi, demonstrate the early adoption and adaptation of Tang literary forms in the Nara and Heian periods. Similarly, Korean court archives preserve anthologies and commentaries inspired by Tang literary and philosophical works, reflecting both aesthetic appreciation and administrative utility, as poetry and essay composition became integral to civil examinations and bureaucratic practice. Tang painting and visual arts, evidenced through tomb murals, ceramic fragments, and bronze statuary, influenced neighboring artistic traditions. Archaeological finds from Japan's Nara and Heian period sites, such as temple murals and painted screens, exhibit stylistic parallels to Tang compositions, including the use of perspective, figural composition, and decorative motifs. In Korea, the Three Kingdoms and unified Silla periods adopted Tang-inspired iconography and brush techniques in both religious and secular contexts. These cross-regional adoptions highlight not simple imitation but selective integration, where local traditions synthesize Tang aesthetics with indigenous styles. Architecture and urban planning were similarly influenced. Tang models for palace layouts, Buddhist temple complexes, and city grids informed the design of Haijokyo in Nara and the Silla capital of Gyeongju. Excavated foundations and early blueprints show adherence to Tang axial symmetry, courtyard organization, and ceremonial spatial hierarchies. In Vietnam, Tang urban planning and religious architecture left durable marks on the design of early imperial centers, illustrating the dynasty's broader spatial and symbolic influence. Religious scholarship, particularly Buddhist and Taoist thought, further demonstrates Tang cultural reach. Manuscripts of Buddhist sutras, commentaries, and ritual texts exported to Japan and Korea provide direct evidence of doctrinal transmission. Tang-era scriptural compilations, calligraphy styles, and printing techniques informed both ritual performance and literary practice abroad. Epigraphic evidence from Korean and Japanese temple steles confirms the replication of Tang iconographic and textual conventions, underscoring the dynasty's role as a conduit of trans-regional religious and intellectual exchange. Interpretively, Tang cultural influence reflects the dynasty's combination of institutional support, urban sophistication, and literary innovation. State patronage of academies, court-sponsored poetry competitions, and temple construction not only fostered domestic artistic achievement, but facilitated exportable cultural models. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that these models were integrated into local traditions, providing a standardized yet adaptable cultural vocabulary that persisted long after the dynasty's political decline. The cross-regional adoption of Tang culture illustrates the dynasty's soft power as an organizing framework for East Asian aesthetics and intellectual life. By providing codified literary forms, artistic techniques, and religious texts, the Tang state enabled neighboring polities to cultivate administrative, religious, and artistic sophistication while simultaneously enhancing cultural cohesion across the region. Manuscript transmission, ceramic parallels, and architectural modeling collectively demonstrate that Tang influence was structural, not merely ornamental, embedding patterns of cultural authority that guided subsequent generations. In conclusion, Tang cultural and artistic traditions shaped the development of literature, visual arts, architecture, and religious scholarship across East Asia. Evidence from manuscripts, temple inscriptions, and archaeological sites confirms that Tang aesthetic and intellectual models were widely disseminated, selectively integrated, and institutionally supported abroad. The dynasty's emphasis on literary refinement, visual coherence, and religious codification created a durable cultural legacy, ensuring that Tang artistic principles remained foundational for centuries in China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Finally, the Tang legacy endures in modern historical interpretation. If you want, I can now expand section 10.3, Tang historical memory and enduring influence almost equals 600 words, to complete chapter 10 and close the documentary script. Do you want me to proceed? You said, section 10.3, modern interpretation and historical significance, almost equals 600 words, summary, 150 to 200 words. This section evaluates how modern historians interpret Tang history using archaeological discoveries, re-examined texts, and comparative analysis. Key themes include state formation, frontier interaction, and cultural diversity. The narrative is strictly analytical, avoiding romanticized descriptions. Hook. Modern scholarship continues to reinterpret the Tang through new textual and archaeological evidence. Target audience insight provides viewers with current academic perspectives grounded in historiographic methodology. Logical transition. End of documentary. ChatGPT said, "Here's A is almost equal to 650-word full expansion of Chapter 10, Section 10.3, Modern Interpretation and Historical Significance, written in a calm, academic, Documentary-ready style. Chapter 10, Section 10.3 Modern Interpretation and Historical Significance, almost equals 600 words. Hook. Modern scholarship continues to reinterpret the Tang through new textual and archaeological evidence. Contemporary historians approach Tang history with a focus on structural analysis, regional interaction, and evidence-based reconstruction. Excavations at urban centers such as Chang'an and Luoyang have revealed settlement patterns, administrative complexes, and material culture that clarify population distribution, economic networks, and state infrastructure. Artifacts including ceramics, coinage, and textiles provide empirical data on trade, consumption, and technological capabilities. Comparative studies of Dunhuang manuscripts, frontier reports, and epigraphic evidence allow researchers to map administrative practices, military organization, and religious activity with unprecedented specificity. Archaeological evidence has also revised understanding of Tang frontier dynamics. Discoveries in the Ordos region, the Darim Basin, and along the northern steppe elucidate interactions with Turkic, Tibetan, and other regional polities. Inscriptions, diplomatic correspondence, and military dispatches indicate that frontier governance was negotiated through both coercion and alliance, highlighting the complex nature of imperial control. This challenges earlier models that emphasized a rigid, centralized bureaucracy, revealing instead a flexible system capable of integrating multi-ethnic populations and regional power structures. Modern textual analysis has refined interpretations of Tang state formation and political culture. Re-examination of the Old Book of Tang, New Book of Tang, and the Zizhi Tongjian, in conjunction with recently discovered memorials and legal documents, illuminates patterns of bureaucratic innovation, factionalism, and succession politics. Scholars now situate events such as the Xuanwu Gate Incident, the Inlushan Rebellion, and the Huangchao Uprising within broader structural frameworks, interpreting them as outcomes of institutional pressures rather than solely individual ambition or moral failure. This methodological approach emphasizes the interplay of demographic, fiscal, and military factors in shaping historical outcomes. Tang cultural achievements are similarly reassessed through comparative and material perspectives. Manuscript studies, iconographic analysis, and cross-regional comparisons document the spread of literary, artistic, and religious practices across East Asia. Research demonstrates that Tang influence was both direct, through diplomatic and scholarly transmission, and indirect, as neighboring polities adapted Tang models to local conditions. The integration of textual and archaeological evidence permits a more nuanced understanding of Tang's soft power and its role in shaping long-term cultural landscapes. Interpretively, modern scholarship frames the Tang Dynasty as a dynamic and adaptive empire whose longevity depended on the interaction of administrative sophistication, military organization, and cultural production. By combining documentary, epigraphic, and material evidence, historians highlight the ways in which the Tang negotiated internal challenges, regional diversity, and cross-cultural exchange. This evidence-based approach situates the dynasty not as a monolithic or idealized polity, but as a complex system shaped by geography, resources, and institutional design. In conclusion, contemporary analysis demonstrates that the Tang dynasty's historical significance extends beyond its chronological duration. Archaeology, re-evaluated textual sources, and comparative methodologies reveal patterns of governance, frontier interaction, and cultural influence that inform both East Asian history and broader studies of imperial systems. These perspectives underscore the value of empirically grounded interpretation, illustrating that Tang history remains a subject of active inquiry and continuous scholarly refinement. If you found this exploration of the Tang dynasty insightful, consider subscribing for more in-depth historical documentaries. Each episode examines the rise and fall of civilizations with evidence-based research, archaeological findings, and carefully reconstructed narratives. Join us as we continue to uncover the forces that shaped human history across time and place. End of documentary.